Right. Order, everybody. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 22nd of June 2026. The UK's steel industry has been placed under significant pressure in recent years. Rising energy prices, decarbonisation, uncertainty over trade and tariffs from the US and EU, as well as increased global competition, have all contributed to this current situation. British Steel employed 4,052 permanent staff as at the 31st of January this year and has the last two remaining operational blast furnaces in the UK located at Scunthorpe. In April 2025, following concerns that these blast furnaces would be closed, therefore putting the UK industries and jobs at risk, the government passed emergency legislation in one day to prevent the closure of these furnaces. In March this year, the government also published its steel strategy. The key aims of the strategy to ensure that the viability of UK steel industry to move towards green steel production and to attract new investment in the sector. So today we are fortunate to have with us a panel of witnesses with huge wealth of knowledge and experience working in the industry ahead of the questioning of our main government officials in the second session this afternoon. We'll be asking our witnesses for their thoughts on the government's intervention, its impact on steel workers, the local community in Scunthorpe, as well as the government's new steel strategy, amongst other key issues. So we've got a very good panel of witnesses in front of us today. So what I'd like to do, perhaps start with you, Charlotte, ask every one of you to introduce yourself, who you are, and what union you represent would be really helpful. Of course, we all know that Councillor Rob is a councillor, so you're not in the same camp. But please introduce yourself first, Charlotte, please.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me. I'm Charlotte Brumpton-Childs. I am the National Secretary for the GMB Union, looking after the private sector. I'm also a former steel worker at the Scunthorpe plant, and just to declare an interest, I sit on the Government's Steel Council that was part of putting together the steel strategy that was launched a couple of weeks ago.
Well, I'm sure we will benefit from your experience. Councillor Rob, please introduce yourself.
Councillor Rob Waltham. I'm the leader of North Lincolnshire Council. I've been a councillor there for 20-something years, and I've been the leader for nearly 10. So I've been around everything that's happened in the steel industry for all of the time that we've had our challenges.
We're glad to have you. Linda, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Linda McCulloch. I'm a National Officer with Unite the Union, and my remit is engineering, manufacturing and steel.
Finally, by no means least, Paul, please.
Pleased to meet everybody. Paul McKenna, National Secretary for Steel Light Industries for Community Union. I was based in Corby Tube Works for 26 years, so I went from British Steel, private owners, so it's coming full circle, so thanks for inviting.
So just for absolute clarity, I should let everybody know that I had a short private meeting with the Minister, Chris McDonald, yeah, and David Bickerton. I don't think anything particularly secret was there discussed, but I've certainly learnt a little. So without any further ado, my very excellent Deputy Clive Betts would like to start the questioning, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Obviously there are big national implications for what happens at Scunthorpe, but we know in particular the direct impact on both the workers and the community, so it's great to have you all with us this afternoon. I'm going to ask the trade union reps to begin with. What changes have the workers experienced since the government announced an intervention into Scunthorpe? Has it improved morale or changed morale in any way? What's the kick-off?
Most definitely. I think it settled the workforce down because there's been so much uncertainty, particularly under when Jingy was there. So yeah, I think it's been really, really good for the workforce.
I think a real key indicator of that is that for 3 or 4 years previous to the government's intervention, there had been no intake of apprentices at Scunthorpe Steelworks. So there's already quite an age gap and an ageing workforce in that area. Since government's intervention, they restarted the apprenticeship programme, and in September last year they took on over 50 apprentices for the first time, I think in 5 years, yeah. Linda. And I think that not only is that a vote of confidence from those young people that have applied for those apprenticeships, but from our community. When I started my career in the steel industry, it's because my uncle encouraged me to apply for an apprenticeship, and I was told quite emphatically, that's a job for life, Charlotte. If you go there and do that, then you will never struggle to earn a wage. And I hope that and think that the government's intervention has helped move public perception back towards that area.
Paul.
Well, concerning, I took over the national role early February and getting involved as to meeting individuals, members on site. For me, speaking to people, it's gave some sort of reassurance, and also the fact that for us, and Charlotte and Linda were there before regarding Jingye, etc. There's, the doors weren't so much open about trying to engage. We've been working as a team up in Scunthorpe with the management regarding health and safety, regarding other issues, but it's now about collaboration, working together to make sure that what we're doing is right for the future.
And before the emergency legislation last year, were workers really fearing they were looking over a cliff edge and everything was going to close?
We were in in-depth negotiations with Jingye for a number of months about the transitional arrangements for Scunthorpe and moving towards a decarbonisation plan. We got incredibly concerned, as did the UK management and people in the background, about Jingye's approach to those conversations and their earnestness in the conversations that we were having. When Jingye made the announcement that they intended to close the blast furnaces, we held town hall meetings for our members, and we saw 600 to 700 people within the space of about 4 hours coming to speak to the trade unions about what are we going to do, how are we going to protect our jobs, and how are we going to protect our livelihoods and our industry. So it really felt before that intervention that we were right on the precipice of something irreversible happening to our industry.
So, I'm going to turn, please, to Councillor Rob Waltham, and we're really pleased to have you representing the council here, and ask you what impacts you've observed in the local community since the change.
Well, I just to set context, always I'm a son of somebody who worked at the steelworks, so it is a culture. So just to evidence what Charlotte said, we were always told it was the job for life, and I went off to university much to my father's disgust instead of going and work at the steelworks. But I think generally the community do feel like that the industry is much more stable. I think like the union colleagues, I even went to China to try and liaise with Jingye to try and stabilise some of the relationships, because a significant employer, we needed to make sure that those relationships were there. We even talked to them about how we could try and expand some of the operations that they could have on site, but it was all a bit futile, because the underlying premise behind their engagement was they needed to make a decision about how steel making would continue in the country, full stop. And so their investment became more and more tenuous as the time went on, which clearly left people feeling incredibly vulnerable. And it is significant when you say 4,000 employees, but when you look at the broader context of any level of economic evidence says there's 20,000 employees, which is a significant proportion of our working age population as a county area. The aftershock of losing the steelworks would be so dramatic. We would never recover without years of economic stimulus. That's the extent of the requirements that would have been needed. So I think, really just to evidence the point that it's heartening that we have this level of stability, but the great challenge we have, it's not purely ownership. The nationalisation and putting steps to creating a stable platform for which I've been welcoming for some time and actually calling for. The challenge we have is we still don't have an operating environment in which ownership is only one element of, that we need to make sure it's competitive for steel making to exist for years to come. And that's not just servicing markets, it's about how we prepare the next level of investment that's needed to make British steel competitive, and also to remove the constant perpetual challenge we've had for many years, that frankly uncertainty in the workforce, whether that's the problems it causes for families getting a mortgage or any of the other things, we need to make sure we resolve that, and also keep steel security and the viability of our industry critical going forward. So
that's really helpful. We will, of course, and you're very welcome to stay if any of you wish to, be addressing the Minister or the Permanent Secretary and some of their officials in the next session on precisely some of those points.
Okay.
So thank you very much for that opening sort of introduction, all of you really. Sarah Green, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask Rob, if I may, when the Department for Business and Trade was negotiating with Jinjay, forgive me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, at what stage did you become involved? Like, at what point did you have input?
Well, pretty constantly, really. We work really closely with Nick Dakin as the local Member of Parliament and Martin Vickers, who's here. They work together as a tag team on this. So any opportunity the department do talk and liaise, with us. Officials work with our officials at the council because, we've been here before. I've chaired a task force on 3 occasions where the industry failed. So, I have to say that you get the best of the UK civil service and government working effectively together when you get an economic shock, sadly, then you get that. But it is, it's very much a part of how we work together.
Could you give us some colour? In what ways were you able to input into the negotiations, for example? So
we were very consciously aware that I'd held my own relationship with Jinjay that we were feeding back to the government. So we went to China on the basis of working to try and understand what their agenda was around investment in the site. They were, it's fair to say, we struggled to get a permanent commitment, so we were passing that intelligence back to government so that they were aware. We regularly have, as I say, with the local members of Parliament, and we worked and fed into government to make sure that we were managing relationships at local level, having a strategic relationship with Jinjay and their officials in China and locally. And we'd committed that to a weekly meeting on site that we were again feeding into government. So the questions that the government was struggling to get answers to, we were able to go and make sure that we were part of that sort of
almost as a united.
Absolutely, yeah. It's hand in glove. We have there's absolutely no partisanship. It's about the place and how we make sure we support the people that work there.
So how effective would you say DBT's, the department's engagement with your council has been? It sounds like you would rate them quite highly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have to say, for the last 4 years, this has been an ongoing issue since we ended up in a situation where Jinjay were successful. So it's been a while. So the relationship with ministers has been present certainly for the last 4 or so years. And in that time, we've been able to share intelligence. But I think more importantly, it's worked really effectively. The challenge has always been, in this case, is that, you were dealing with forgive my phraseology, an alien partner who had their own business interests that they were trying to coordinate. And so our job was to work absolutely aligned to try and get as much out of as we could. So the news it was never a shock, and I know Charlotte will agree, it was never a shock that Jinjay weren't as committed as they needed to be to Scunthorpe, but it didn't stop us still trying to have that relationship with them, not least because fundamentally they were the people, coordinating whether these people would have a job, that local workers were going to have a job, but also whether the investment was going to happen going forward.
I may just ask one last question. Yeah. It sounds like you had a very effective channel of communication with the department.
Yeah.
Was that based on how they conducted themselves? Was it based on relationships? Was it based on individuals? Like, how would you?
Yeah.
What would you pinpoint as the reason why
I think
that
we
worked?
we agreed quite early the outcome was that the predominance. We operate a value set around steel making, cross-party at the council, which sets the culture for the tone of the working relationship. So the message, when we go to full council, 43 councillors, we all vote to support the steel industry, which is important. So those values, that outcomes basis, and then it was relationships, so the relationships that we have, with the local elected members of Parliament, with Nick and Martin, and obviously officials clearly have that, those permanent relationships, which has been critical to making sure that we'd got the support we need should anything happen, but we were permanently risk assessing and looking for opportunities. And I would add that actually something that we are working on going forward is looking at the future of the site so we can build more resilience, and that's been an ongoing conversation for a number of years. So, you know, it's good relationships, but also it's good values around the outcome of protecting steel making for the country, but the local people.
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Thank you both. That's very useful dialogue. Matt, please. Matt Temain.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. I'd like to ask the union leaders how effective you think the department's communication with you has been over this process.
I have engaged with DBT for a number of years now on the steel industry. It's always been part of my remit as a national officer and the national secretary for the GMB. And I think that the department and the civil servants within the department have been key to this successful intervention. So I think whilst we were dealing with an unpredictable partner in Jingye, I think is the fairest way to say it, we have always had the civil servants, regardless of which government was in power and which Secretary of State was running the department, that fundamentally believe in the importance of the steel industry and the need to support and sustain it, which has been so helpful because obviously through elections and changes in ministerial remits, having that sort of consistent, like you say, like agreement in values that this is important and we need to do what we can to support it has been really fundamental to us being able to shift the dial on some of this stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Charlotte's saying, regarding that. It's how those communication links have to be open, because that's so important. Because we have to be felt that we're being listened to of our concerns going forward. So those have to be listened. And we at Community, welcome and thanked a lot of the process along the way that people were listening. So we think that was a good outcome.
Right.
I don't think there's anything I can actually add to that because I think Charlotte and Paul have covered it eloquently.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and that sounds positive. Can I also ask, what do you think the department's communication with workers directly was like? Was that good as well, or was it mostly just going through you guys? Or
I think it was very good, particularly after Parliament resat on the Saturday morning. Yes. We had a lot of government ministers. We had Rachel Reeves, we had Johnny Reynolds, we had Angela Rayner, and it was good because we had all the shop stewards from the 3 separate unions there. So that message was getting out to the workforce, and it was really, really good, and it really lifted spirits right across the site.
Yeah. I mean, it was a very unusual situation.
Yeah.
To be called back for that. So okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Matt, very much. Rupert Lowe, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I was going to ask this question in the next session, but I thought it was rather more appropriate to ask it of you. Now, obviously, we are all concerned about the employment of people and their families and their communities and everything else. But the thing I'm maybe missing, and I was going to ask you what you think about this, is I can't see how this intervention in steelmaking in the UK can work until we actually get a proper plan, a business plan, which sets out how we're going to do it. And I may be missing something, perhaps you can enlighten me, but while we have a lunatic policy on energy, because the basis of steelmaking, as I don't need to tell you, is cheap energy. And we're talking about China, Jingye, or whatever they call themselves.
Jingye.
But at the end of the day, China is still mining coal, building railways, and it is burning coal, as in India, in their power stations. So we have this fixation with decarbonisation, which, by the way, carbon is at a relatively low level historically in geological time, but yet we have a fixation about it. So what I wanted to know is, surely by intervening without a plan, aren't we just consigning the British taxpayer to funding the losses that we make because of our lunatic energy policy, which means that steel making is destined to fail in this country until we get the sort of dynamics right? Am I missing something?
So the first point is the cost of not intervening is unfathomable.
No, that's not the question I asked.
Please let me finish.
I accept that. But I'm asking you the question about
let Charlotte do the counterfactual first.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The cost of not intervening is unfathomable. So if the government hadn't acted at that time in that way, then those jobs would be gone, and we wouldn't have any debate about energy policy or decarbonisation or the emission trading scheme, because it wouldn't matter, because the blast furnaces would have died and those jobs would have disappeared.
No, I get that.
And I think that there's so there is obviously work to do on energy policy, and energy is action on energy policy, on procurement, on trading rules have been something that the unions have long campaigned for intervention on to level the playing field. But there is a misconception that decarbonisation is driving these policy decisions, and it's not. So if you look at the coke oven closure at Scunthorpe, which happened a couple of years previous, that wasn't because the carbon emissions were costing so much they had to close them. It was because Jingye had not invested, and the predecessors Grable and Tata Steel before that had not invested in this infrastructure in decades, and so it was a death trap, and they had to close it because it wouldn't work anymore. And then we rewrite history to say it was closed because of the carbon emissions, and the cost of those made it untenable. That's not true. It's because it didn't work anymore. And I think that whilst we do need a coherent plan for steel, I totally agree with you, and we need a longer term plan around energy prices for energy intensive industries and a coherent decarbonisation plan. And we all agree as the three trade unions that we need a route to decarbonise steel because of the commercial environment that British Steel find themselves in. The intervention that was made by the government has given us the space to be able to make that plan, rather than making rash short-term decisions that leave options off the table that if we had more time we could make.
No, I do understand that, but on the one hand we're watching Aberdeen die a death because we're not using the natural hydrocarbons, i.e. gas and oil, which we have offshore the Shetlands and across the country. But on the other hand, we're intervening to rescue an industry which relies on cheap energy. We have the most expensive energy in Europe here, as you all know. So what is the solution to that? Other than, because at the end of the day, this committee exists to protect the British taxpayer, who is abused at all turns and twists by the government. And they all may very well have helped you with this intervention, and I understand the reason for actually intervening to save the closure of the furnaces. I'd like to see blast furnaces here producing for national security reasons, but I don't see a plan from the government. And on the one hand, they're destroying our energy industry, and on the other hand, they're trying to bail out our steel industry. Does that not strike you as slightly odd?
I was just going to say, there's a challenge here. Look, first of all, ownership, as I alluded to in my first statement, is only one element of how you get a stable industry. It doesn't matter whether that's in any sector. Ownership is one element. We had uncertain ownership, so that had to have a step in to resolve. The market had failed, so we had to step in. That's absolutely my position. Let me finish this point. So the rest of the world provides a stimulus to protect their steel industry. You go to France, you go to Germany, they have
cheap energy.
And they put through cheap energy and other measures, I would argue, whether that's procurement or other. So there is a stimulus. So if you want British Steel to function in a competitive environment, you have to be able to provide the same level of stimulus, particularly now when the market has failed, to give some certainty around how that will work. The environment that British Steel needs to operate, and I absolutely support Charlotte's view here, part of that's around investment, because for a number of years we haven't had the investment in plant that was needed to make British Steel competitive, or for them to be, as productive.
Have you discussed the government's energy policy?
As they absolutely.
Have you told them that this is the root cause of your problem?
Absolutely. At every turn, it is being presented that unless you can create an environment around tariff, around taxation, around the barriers to investment, around the energy that needs to be significantly cheaper for that to work effectively, then effectively you'll never have a stable steel industry. So I think that's fully understood. But also, if you're going to make British Steel a strategic industry, because you look at the volatility of price, supply, conflict, all the other factors that mean you'll never, you look at all those factors, you have what you call classically in economic terms, a lad from Lincolnshire, son of a steelworker here, you'd say absolutely that you've got an imperfect market. So you have to do so only a stable plan to make sure that you can invest effectively in the steel plant, to make sure it's effective, only making sure that you set it as a strategic industry and make sure that steel is a critical part of your infrastructure going forward. Remember, you're not investing here in a market that's diminishing, you're investing in a growth market. We provide a very small proportion of steel usage for our country. So you look at the other factors across the world, if you leave yourself vulnerable to those factors...
I understand all that, and I totally buy into the strategic importance.
But Mr. Loaf,
but the oxymoron I can't get my mind around is, on the one hand, we're bailing out an industry, we're killing on the other hand.
But Mr. Loaf, we've got the basis of the question. I think you must let people answer.
But you don't get to do one without the other. You have to create a stable industry to make sure that it can do all the things that you need it to do.
You can't do that with high energy prices.
But you have to do it at this. But you have to do it at the same time to enable you to transition. There is nobody who advocates for cleaner, greener energy, good, clean energy that works effectively than I can assure you. Do I think solar panels should be on fields? Another point, Chair, forgive me. Of course I don't. But what I think what we lack is cheap energy that will enable that plant to work effectively. That's a significant barrier, and I would argue that some of the government's policies around energy are fundamentally flawed when applied to the steel.
That was the answer I wanted to get.
I'll happily give you those, but the steps to make it, you can't do it in isolation. You have to work those things through together, and then you'll have a viable business plan that means we're meeting market expectations, competitive to the world, and more importantly, you've got certainty over the steel you're going to need and use, and at the same time we keep jobs.
No. I think did you want to come in? Yes, Paul, please.
Just. We can't sit here and you mentioned about steel being made in China, etc. We can't dictate that, but we have to look at what's happening here. Now, British Steel is part of different companies in the UK that is part of a supply chain that is going to make valuable product, valuable infrastructures for this country to make it secure. Plate mills, everything that we need to look at. So it goes across the board. What's happening in Port Talbot? How the unions reacted to Port Talbot with the furnaces going down, a bit too early. We should have maybe stood back and watched what was happening. There's a transition happening there. We're supporting that transition, but regarding what's happening in the UK, we have to look at the bigger picture, because there is steel companies that is producing steel with that furnaces here. But the bigger picture is how we can get to that aim. And I understand the question, and I think you may be trying to get us to say that there's no plan for British Steel in this country. There is a plan. There is a plan to secure those jobs. Now, the average person within those plants, for that bigger picture, really isn't interested. It's what goes on his table for his kids that night, or the mortgage for the house. That's what they're interested in at the minute, and that's what we're trying to protect as trade unionists. And the bigger picture regarding those issues around energy, of course we have told the government energy needs to be reduced. Why wouldn't we? Because it's too high. Everybody can see that. But we can only deal with what's in front of us, and we're trying to do that step by step by working with these companies. I was up at Hartlepool 42-inch mill the other week. Now the transition that's happened there, with a company coming in and giving future and giving stability to those people that were laid off for months and months and months. They're back now at work. It's fantastic for the area, for the local economy. We need to see that bigger picture, not just narrow it down. Not just narrow it down.
The taxpayers funding it.
We understand
that. It's not a viable industry at the moment.
But the plan would make it viable. There's economists that already said that within the steel industry in the UK, we have got a viable business that can succeed. Yeah, we may need that little lift up, and that comes from the taxpayer, and we understand that money's valuable to the taxpayer, which we're all part of. For me, I think it's money well spent.
But finally,
hang on, Rupert, let Linda and Charlotte, would you like to have a go at this at all?
Look, I mean, as far as energy costs are concerned, my union has openly campaigned, on high energy costs, particularly, what has been happening in the North Sea. I'm not going to sit here and deny that, and we've actively been campaigning because we have workers in the North Sea, we have workers in oil refineries, etc. So, yeah, there has to be a lot more done around a government energy policy, because, every one of us sitting here represent members that are in industries which are high intensive energy users, and it makes them really uncompetitive.
Doesn't matter whether it's cement or aluminium.
Exactly.
Or
And
Glass.
and just to finish off, the issue in the steel industry and energy prices is not gas, it's electricity.
Yeah.
At Scunthorpe, they burn blast furnace gas, so they don't have a natural gas connection, which was part of the issue we had with closing the blast furnaces. But it's the electricity prices that are the issue there, and projects like Hinkley Point C and Sizewell C and the new nuclear projects that have been announced will help reduce those energy prices. There's more to do, and there's certainly more support required for the North Sea oil workers. GMB campaign alongside Unite incredibly seriously around those things.
We'll come on in a minute, and Rupert, you may want to take part in that discussion as to what you think the next steps should be. But for now, Clive Betts, please.
Yeah. And of course, some of us might just ask the question if you want to answer it or not. Actually, the cheapest form of electricity in this country are renewables by a long way. The problem is the electricity pricing system doesn't reflect that properly. It reflects the expensive price of gas, and that's one of the fundamental problems. And of course, China is developing more renewables than anywhere else in the world currently.
Burning more coal as well.
Okay, well, let's look at the forward progress on that one. But come back to what we're dealing with here and now. Is nationalisation going to be a major step forward? Has it got benefits, or can you see some downsides in it at all from the point of view of your employees?
I think that the transition for Scunthorpe is a difficult one, and if you look to Port Talbot and what is currently happening for Tata Steel and the challenges that they're facing in maintaining their business while they're not producing virgin steel to transition to decarbonised steel, you see what happens when there's a pot of money that isn't big enough and a plan that is dependent on a too small pot, rather than thinking about what do we need, okay, where do we get that money from, and then moving it in that way. I believe that there is a bright future for Scunthorpe steel industry. We spent a considerable amount of time looking at the different decarbonisation options before the government intervention. The complicated question around ownership has meant that we've sort of put a pause on those discussions while that ownership question is resolved. I understand that there's legislation going through Parliament that will hopefully give us an answer to that. But fundamentally, the options that we had in front of us when we started those conversations with Jingye are the options that we need to explore. And I think the key message from the trade unions and from our members is do it with them, not to them. Do it for them, not against them, and ensure that a transition protects our jobs and our communities. I want my children to have the option to go and work on the steelworks when they're at the right age to go do that, and I'm sure that that my colleagues feel the same way. But there is, if you look at the government steel strategy, there is absolutely space for growth. There is space to improve our domestic usage of UK steel. Some of the tariffs that are being introduced in July will help to stimulate some of that growth. They're not perfect, by the way. Chair, there's work to be done on those to make sure we don't stifle other areas of the steel industry. But I think the steel strategy is the first one that I've seen in the industry for a long time. And I know I look incredibly young, but I started working in the steel industry when I was 16, so I've been around it a while now. It's the first one that has practical steps that the government and the industry are going to take to make the industry viable moving forward. And it encompasses things like energy prices, it encompasses things like procurement, and about ensuring that we grow the market share, not manage decline.
So obviously government have seen the steel industry as being part of national security. We have to have sovereign capability to be able to make our own steel. And obviously, as the forecast for steel is going to go up, that becomes more and more important. I mean, we know eventually at Scunthorpe probably we will transition to green steel, but we also want that to be a workers' transition. We don't want to see anybody left behind. When I look, obviously, what happened at Port Talbot, where all of a sudden the blast furnaces were closed, we had massive redundancies. That is not the right way to handle a transition going forward. So, as Charlotte has already indicated, we had a few plans on the table that we were looking at. We didn't get that option when we met with Jingye in March of last year, because they more or less told us that they were intending to stop iron production and shut the furnaces down, and that's when panic mode started. So it would be good to get back round the table and start having those discussions and having a proper transition for Scunthorpe going forward, because we want to see steel there for the next 50 years.
Sorry, you're saying back round the table. I thought you'd have been round the table for the last few months looking at these issues. I mean,
well, obviously we've been having discussions with the company, but obviously we need to be having discussions with government ministers.
Haven't they been happening for the last few months, those discussions?
Well, you sit in the Steel Council, Charlotte, I don't, so
Yeah,
maybe Charlotte's better to answer that.
We meet with the company incredibly regularly. We also meet with Chris MacDonald as the Minister. We're responsible on regular intervals. Right. To be frank, though, the conversations about the long-term future of Scunthorpe cannot be had until we don't have a silent owner sat in the background, because we're in such a strange scenario at the minute where government are paying for it, and they are running the day-to-day operations. But if the ambition of the government, which is not necessarily the GMB's view, but if the ambition of the government is to find a private equity partner or owner, then they cannot make decisions that would commit an owner down a certain path. We need Jingye out the way, because there's I guess like a moral argument about whether you're committing an owner to something that they don't have a say in, so that we then can make those long-term plans. So we have short to medium-term plans. There is no concern from the trade unions or the workforce in terms of the viability of Scunthorpe, and there's an understanding and acknowledgement from our members that we will have that conversation about decarbonisation, and the options that we had put in front of us, perhaps some of the options that the trade union proposed back to the company, will be back on the table as soon as that ownership conversation has been resolved.
So getting the ownership resolved and then looking at the future.
Yes.
Maybe private capital coming in or maybe not, but they're the sorts of options you want to be part of the
Yeah,
discussion.
of course, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Do you, Chair? Could I just come
Sorry,
on that point?
Rob, yes.
I think the challenge we've got, clearly Treasury are watching the money, the budget fall down on this day by day because of the costs of subsidising. I do actually agree with that point, and I think my worry is that they'll go into a turnaround space, which is not. This needs, the industry needs investment to catch them up, to make them competitive, which I think actually everyone would accept. If you make yourself really competitive, you've got a fighting chance. That could come from some UK-owned private sector investment as much as it should be government. But again, that's got to have some transparency around the space around that. But what I wouldn't want to do in this transitionary time is end up bringing somebody in who tells you turn around a business by stopping doing a whole range of stuff. Because if we were to stop making steel as part of our transition, all your customers disappear. Can you imagine stopping selling a product and assuming all your market would stay and wait for you to be able to get your new processes and product up and running? It would be a folly. But a purely accounting economic model might say, well, while we're doing that, can we stop doing... So we need to be really transparent about the way that we do this. Taxpayers' money aside, which everybody, I promise you, everybody who lives in the community, all the workers are very conscious of the fact they're supported by taxpayers' money. Nobody is sat there saying we're at a folly. But fundamentally, if we accept that we need to keep strategic capability around steel making for the sake of our nation, for steel security, we're not going to be able to do that without a stimulus. You either let the industry fail and then spend years trying to recover the community, trying to get people out of workers' families and all, or you spend it now to invest effectively, which I do think was the previous government's plan as well, because I was sat here with Nuz Ghani having those conversations. Andrea led some. This has been a long understood premise, but fundamentally you have to invest in this industry. If it's strategic, if it matters to you, you have to do it. And I think, if anything, if we look at the projections for steel making and demand, we currently produce about 3 million tonnes. We consume 9 million tonnes. We're likely to need 14 million tonnes to keep our economy growing, with its data centres or whatever else is needed, just general infrastructure. If you don't have a capacity for that, you're stuck at the world's market. They will sell you at the quality they have, at the price they demand, at the time that they will permit. And that's why this is a strategic industry, and you cannot afford to leave ourselves at the whim purely of the market. Of course, there are considerations to make this business profitable. It needs to be profitable, otherwise it won't be viable for the long run.
Thank you very much for that. That's a very helpful raison d'etre for the keeping the plant open. So, Tris, please, next.
Yeah, so 2 questions, if I may. One of which follows on from what you've just said. Obviously, the subsidy at the moment, £1.3 million a day. Have you got, the government has looked at alternative models. So, for instance, private equity investment, very similar to size will be, where they have got 49% private equity support there. Have the unions got any comments on what this nationalised model might look like? Appreciating fully, there's currently conversations with Ginger going on at the moment. So have you been able to feed back into that? And my second question is just around the liabilities. Obviously, if nationalisation happens, there's pensions, there's debts, there's liabilities. Have there been any conversations around that? And then just lastly, just around what footprint do you expect going forward? Because obviously the sector at the moment with investment might require a smaller headcount, or it might require new ways of thinking. Is that something you'd be willing to open to a conversation about, and has that been discussed?
I think regarding the government, sorry,
It's okay, carry on.
the first point about private investment, there's always been no secret that government has always says that there would be private investors and things, like that going forward. The public interest test regarding what the future of that plant is, for the plans, the strategic, the product, etc. So we would always say that there's a possibility that there could be, private investment in those things. But the only concern that for myself and not speaking for the rest is we've been burnt so many times with people coming in with false promises, and we need to make sure that members don't. That's the way it goes. But we need to be answering those questions. We need to put those questions forward, if that is to allay fears on that site or any site in the UK, because there's a lot going on in the steel industry within the UK. The footprint, as the site itself, how that works, because the headcount, we would hope that would be increasing due to the fact of tonnages increasing, furnaces getting ramped up, bringing in apprentices like what's happening. So it's all part of everything step by step as you've laid out there. Those questions probably can't be answered all directly at the moment, but those questions certainly are being raised about how that can look going forward. As Charlotte says, we do speak to the company regularly, we put questions to the company, because our members are contacting us continuously, and our reps on the sites about what's happening, what's the next steps, so we have to try and have those answers for them. But we're not just going to tell our members anything to get them off our backs. We want facts, we want figures, so that they have some security and some future going forward. I think that's what we're all about.
Just to add on to what Paul said, obviously we've been here before with private equity firms investing in steel or under-investing in steel, and quite frankly it's left quite a bad taste in my mouth, what's happened in the steel industry, particularly all across the steel industry, but particularly at Scunthorpe, because obviously we had Greybill who went into administration, and then obviously followed on by Jingy, who did not invest. They might have invested in the site, but certainly didn't invest in the infrastructure, because if you to go up and actually look at the site, there's parts of it that are quite derelict and parts of it are quite dangerous. So obviously if it came to any private investment, I would still like to see government maintaining some sort of stake. I don't think we can be left to the mercy going forward, private equity firms. And because our steel industry is a strategic industry in the UK, and we must maintain that going forward. So I think, private equity money coming in, great, but I still see government must maintain a stake.
GMB policy is really clear. We believe that the steel industry should be nationalised. I think so we've worked with Greybill, Liberty, Tata, all those iterations over the last couple of decades. And I think even in the example of Tata, who sort of pride themselves on being a business that respects and works with the communities that they operate within, you look at Port Talbot, and that is where the bottom line is. There comes a point where they get to choose between shareholder profit and working class communities, and this side never ever win. And that is why government have to We believe that they should wholly nationalise it, but at the very least they need to maintain a stake in it, because such a foundational cornerstone industry for our country should not be left at the mercy of shareholder profits. And I know that that's expensive, but I think that is how I want my taxpayer money spent, to protect the communities and the jobs that we live in.
And if I just come back, just to the question I asked about liabilities, so from your members' perspective, pensions and other issues that might be attributed to any transfer, is that something that you're making representations on? Have you had any feedback on that?
We've started conversations with the business about what a transfer would look like to a wholly nationalised steel industry. They are obviously subject to consultation, and I'm genuinely not sure how much of that is confidential or not. Our members are not expecting to see any significant change to any of their terms and conditions with this transfer from Jingye. But what I will say is in 2019, when Jingye took over after the insolvency, they absolutely raided our terms and conditions. Our members work longer hours with less shift premiums, with less overtime pay, with worse pensions. We've done some work on pensions recently, actually, in our recent pay negotiations. But if you think about the terms and conditions that Rob's dad worked under, or even the pension that I started off with when I started, those don't exist anymore. The things that people would attribute to the historic steel industry and seeing people retire in their mid to late 50s and enjoying a retirement, that is just not the reality for steel workers today as it used to be.
Just on that one point, regarding what you're asking us the question, for us that's a question that we should be asking regarding protection and the nationalisation or whatever way it goes forward on terms and conditions, pensions, under any 2P rules. So that's the same question we want answered as well. And we are having those dialogues, but obviously that will be part of the plan that will be decided as to what's happening going forward.
We'll be asking the department shortly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you all very much. We need to speed up, because otherwise our next witnesses are going to be waiting a long time. So, Sarah Green, please.
I'll try and be pithy. I'd like to turn to the government's new steel strategy, and if I may address Councillor Waltham again, how well do you feel the new strategy covers the needs of those areas that are home to steelworks?
Well, I think it certainly recognises the strategic importance of steelmaking, which I think has significant weight in terms of, there are lots of factors that create a sustainable business. So it's the stakeholder, it's the suppliers. Some of these have been burnt in the past in various iterations. We saw local businesses nearly go out of business. They didn't know whether to keep investing in the current operations without, whether it's, we had a local construction firm who put the steel up to create a new shed that was going to be part of steelmaking operations, but nearly went out of business because I think it's critically important to recognise that steel is a strategic industry, and clearly it does that. The concern I have about it is the fact that it is a reducing balance of investment. So my challenge in almost answering a little bit of the last question, Chair, is that we started with £5 billion. It's now £2.5 billion for all sorts of different reasons. At some point that becomes a negative balance, and British Steel in Scunthorpe becomes a problem for Treasury, rather than what we've all narrated to you today, which is a great opportunity to stop bringing in steel from other markets where they already provide a stimulus. So my worry is it sets a pot of money that may not be enough to create a viable steel industry, and I think by any measure the public, taxpayers and many other institutions may look at it and think, well, I'm not sure this is an investment we need, and we don't need that level of criticism now. What we need is to get behind investment in steel making so we can genuinely be competitive in world markets, and also supply some of those opportunities that 14 million tonnes of steel would bring.
And is there any additional government investment that's urgently needed to support the steel sector in your community?
Well, I think there's two elements of it. It's not always about investment. Sometimes it's permissions as such. It's thinking about how locally we could work more effectively. There's 300 acres plus of site there, which I think Linda sort of started to talk about. So it's actually, there could be a whole range of more businesses that are within a cluster around steel making, which could start to see us grow the economy using our strategic capability around steel making. So yes, it's about investment to make sure that whatever the future of steel making looks like, it's properly resourced, the investment is there in place, but at the same time we keep making steel, because if we don't keep making steel, your customers go and nobody resets, and frankly we lose a load of jobs in the meantime. And then creating an environment which we're working really closely on. So we've got an executive board that I chair with the members of Parliament, are very much connected into government, feeding in what we think the future of the site should look like. So we could build that cluster of advanced manufacturing. We could start to get around putting profitable businesses that would all benefit from a really productive steel making plant that would then enable us to add more jobs to the economy, rather than looking at a sort of a diminishing pot of jobs in an industry that we don't want to see fail. So I think it's both, really. It's a permission to enable us to be able to get on with supporting the development that's needed to make the site effective as one. It's a strategic employment site, 300 acres. They've done great work at this up on Teesside. They used it and that's what we need. We need those powers and that permission to be able to get on with delivering that as the local council, as much as we need the investment.
Really helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank
Chair.
you, Sarah. Matt, please. We're next on 9.
On number 9 already, are we? Okay, fantastic. Apologies for that. Thank you. I'd like to again address Charlotte, Paul and Linda, if I may. How well does the department's new steel strategy address the needs of steel workers?
I think it's covered the immediate needs of steel workers, and a lot of what was in the government strategy has already been done. We would like to see probably some more meat put on the bones. Maybe in a second strategy would maybe be around about hydrogen and a DRI plant over a period of time to be introduced, because obviously that would cut down on and transition into low carbon steel making. So I think overall the strategy was there, but at this moment in time, a lot of what's in the strategy has already been done, and obviously we have concerns because whilst Liberty Steel is engaging, or the government receiver is engaging with interested parties for Liberty, we would like to see a positive outcome for that, and we're still a bit away from that at the moment.
Regarding the strategy, there's a commitment of increasing from 30 to 50% regarding, that would be an immediate increase to the value for our members. But also on the back of that, and the steel, it does cover many aspects, and obviously if you're looking at going forward, decarbonisation and future electric arc furnaces, etc., there has to be a strategy regarding the scrap for those products. It goes into those furnaces for products, etc., because there's different grades and there's different, what comes back out of the furnace to go into the product that goes onto the market. So it's good that there's part of that is the set up of a committee regarding looking at that, because if we are transitioning into the electric arc, how much scrap are we going to be needing going forward? So all that needs to be taken into account, and that would affect members' outcomes if we're all struggling for the same materials to put in. So we have to have a plan for that, and I think that's key.
Can I ask a little more about that, actually? So, do you see that as being a beneficial thing to the workforce, that transition to electric arc?
Yeah, as long as we take lessons, from other transitions and how it was done, we would ensure, and I think it was been mentioned earlier, when you cut something off, then there's nothing for people to do. The only thing we can do is put those people out of jobs. That's what we want to do. We want to make sure we get to that transition. We want to make sure it's done sensibly. We will work with the companies of these businesses. If it's the government, we'll work with the government and the local managers. We want to make sure that the steel industry is there for this country going forward. It is a key, for supplying our, industries, for our military, the security of this country. As I say, I mentioned plate. We've got a plate mill up in Scotland, DL, that needs investment. It's there. It's got orders. We're on about maybe looking at a new plate mill somewhere in the UK. Well, we've got one in Scotland. Let's use it and let's get steel into it. I may sound frustrated probably because I am, but it's people are sitting at home now, where they could be making, valuable products for this country. They can't get supply. It's shocking.
Okay, thank you. And then are there areas that you think that the government should be prioritising in terms of its investment to address the immediate risks that the industry is facing?
Well, regarding the immediate risks, and obviously there's investment that's not happened over the period in blast furnaces are big, that need a lot of maintenance, a lot of things that's happening with, there has been issues in the past. So they probably need to be looked at straight away, those furnaces, as to if there is any spot, because we have spoke to the business, the relines, etc. They all take time and they all take money to do that. But for the business going forward, it's a necessity. It's something that we have to jointly work around and make sure that money is available for the relines, etc. that is much needed.
And I think just on the steel strategy, and as I said at the beginning, I sit on the Steel Council, was part of the team that was a small part of the team that put that together. Now, if you ask the GMB what the steel industry needs, it needs 5 times as much money and 10 times as much time to be able to turn it around. So we're never going to say that we've done enough, because there's always more that can be done. But I will say I'm incredibly proud of the work that we did on that committee. I think Sarah Jones MP, when it was her remit, did an incredible job advocating on behalf of our industry. And we sat in the first Steel Council meeting with 6 or 7 different steel companies, all with different priorities and pressures borne down on them. And I think what the department did incredibly well is find the common ground. And don't forget, once upon a time, they were all the same company. It did used to be British Steel as the nationalised, and we could make slabs up in Scunthorpe and send them down to Port Talbot to be rolled through the mill, and it was all very homogenous. But now those things still happen, but everyone's adding a bit on top as it's going around, which creates an economy that makes the steel more expensive. Yes, there's more to do. I think there's stuff outside of the department's control. We talk a little bit about energy policy that has to feed into what we do here. We talk to Treasury about the procurement rules. We talk to DESNAs about the emissions trading scheme. All of that has to feed in to a strategy to ensure that the steel industry is maintained. But what we have in the steel strategy now that we haven't had in the past, I don't believe, is a plan for growth. So where we've been managing decline and how do we mitigate these losses, we're now saying actually, what do we need to grow? If we're saying that we're going to be investing in defence, we should be making the plate that goes into our warships that we're building in Scunthorpe, unequivocally, or in DL. If we are going to be investing in offshore wind, then we should be onshoring the manufacturing capability for those energy infrastructure projects, so that our members and our workforce realise the benefits of that transition. There's no point offshoring the jobs and the carbon responsibilities and not reaping the rewards of the huge investment that is currently being made.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's a real potential and possibility there,
yes,
isn't it, if we get it right. So, hooray for strategies. Thank you very much.
And I think the thing that the strategy did do that we haven't done before is go, okay, we don't have the capability to do this right now. Where's that gap, and how do we meet that gap so we do have the capability moving forward? We're not just accepting we can't do it now, so we're not going to do it.
The future, can I just add, I think the problem is the rest of the world are also doing this, and we don't want to be too late, because that's our big risk, is that competitors, other nations are all investing in this stuff, and they'll get the market by the time we've created it, and then we will have missed the boat, but we'll have built a capacity with which there is no market anyway. So that's a big risk around that. But there's all the more reason to make sure we've got a business plan locally that works for Scunthorpe, which is clearly the essence behind the debate we're having today.
So I'd like to challenge you, if you like, how you're going to get from A to B. Is the future for Scunthorpe electric arc furnaces? If so, how do you get from blast furnaces to electric arc? Do you keep the blast furnaces going as long as they possibly can until the electric arc are built? Bearing in mind, we know there are health and safety issues. There have been outages and stoppages because the existing blast furnaces have not been maintained properly. They've not been relined in the last 20 years. How do we get from A to B?
That is an interesting question, Chair, because the trade unions already put together a plan for Jingye when they said they were going to close the blast furnaces, so we can answer that question. The answer is all of those things. So yes, we should maintain blast furnace operations. As Councillor Waltham said, if we don't, then we stop manufacturing in Scunthorpe while we're building an arc furnace. Now, we are, I'm sure, all acutely aware of the challenges that National Grid have at the minute with those connections. We do not want delays outside of steelmakers' control challenging the economic viability of that transition. Linda already mentioned there is new technology becoming available all the time. A direct reduced iron, a DRI plant, is a good alternative to blast furnace steel longer term, and it also creates jobs, not as many jobs as blast furnaces, by the way, but there is an opportunity in Scunthorpe specifically to have a DRI plant that has hydrogen capability when hydrogen is manufactured at the scale needed to be able to power it, that can be operated with natural gas in the meantime to manage that transition again, to feed an electric arc furnace, which means we're able to make the high grade steel that we currently have to meet the national security requirements that we have, as well as building an electric arc furnace plant. So I think that if there was a tagline for what the trade union plan is for decarbonising Scunthorpe, it is a managed transition. Like, we don't need to do it all right now, we need to do it at the correct pace. And we have an ageing workforce in Scunthorpe. We have the opportunity to take advantage of that natural attrition. So we're not putting people on the job heap, but allowing people to see out their career and also creating new opportunities. As Paul said, we have more than enough demand to create another plate mill, and we should be doing that. That's about 100,000. 100 million pounds to be able to do that as well. We need to build a DRI plant. We don't need a DRI plant for each steel manufacturer, but if we had one that had a hot connect in Scunthorpe and had the Liberty and Tata as a customer, that again creates viability for that site. And the 300 acres that are currently unused could be redeveloped into a brownfield site for an energy infrastructure park for advanced manufacturing, and again, like, reinvigorating. We've got those skills and those capabilities. I'm so proud of where I live and the capability we have there, and we absolutely have an optimistic vision of what that looks like.
Okay, there's two questions, fundamental questions that arise from all of that. Is there a time incentive in this? Because I did refer in my question about the health and safety incidents caused by the lack of investment in the blast furnaces. There have been outages. So is there a problem that there could be a serious incident? You'd have to close the blast furnaces, or one of them.
So those health and safety issues became incredibly serious and sort of immediate when Jingye were still in control, because they were deliberately choosing not to invest in the infrastructure needed to make those things safe. Every single meeting we have with Alan Bell as the CEO, along with government ministers at the appropriate time, the first thing we talk about is health and safety. So there is not, I am not worried about my members and friends going to work in the same way that I was then. Look, it is a dangerous place to work. I'd lost a colleague when I worked there myself. Like, it's never, people should not go to work and not go home. But the immediate concerns, and we had it in Port Talbot, if you remember the debate around closing the coke ovens in Port Talbot, that was, again, they were falling down. It was not safe for people to be there. We're not in that position in Scunthorpe. Yes, there's more investment needed to be made, but there's not an immediate and imminent danger for our members going to work beyond what there usually is for someone that works on a top-tier coma site.
Linda, can I pose a question to you? Earlier on, you caroled a bit about the workforce union arrangements at Port Talbot and the fact that they are converting to electric arc furnaces, and electric arc furnaces need fewer employees. I mean, is there acceptance at Scunthorpe that if you do convert to electric arc furnaces, there will need to be some reduction in employees, or is that not necessary?
No, I think there is an acceptance there. You know, you don't need as many people when you transition to electric arc as what you currently do when you're running blast furnaces, but it's how that transition is managed, and Charlotte's already covered that, you know, through natural attrition, you know, and various other things. Also, you know, reskilling people, you know, because if you've been in a job for a certain period of time, years in fact, if you've been in the steelworks, it's maybe about upskilling people. We want to make sure that when we do it properly, and we do it in a sensible manner, and it's transitioned at a pace.
Yes, just very briefly, I appreciate that the time's running on, but it's a really fascinating discussion, and thanks for giving us your views about, I think, about hope for the future as well as anything else and the way forward. So, what lessons can DBT learn from the intervention in British Steel? It's been going on for an awful long time, it seems. Discussions, working parties, ideas. Are there lessons to be learned about maybe how to do it better with interventions, maybe in the rest of the steel industry or elsewhere?
Yeah, look, it's a huge thing for the government to take the keys off a private company and say, we're going to run this now. And I believe that that should be a last resort. And so with that comes a certain amount of brinkmanship from the owners to make sure that I believe that Johnny Reynolds had to get to a point where there was no other option. And I think he got there. We were clear in a couple of days leading up to that decision to make that intervention that Jingye were about to close our steelworks. We worked really closely with the UK management team and with DBT to make sure that that message was received by Treasury, by the Prime Minister, by the Secretary of State, so that intervention was made. I think my wish was that the nationalisation bit was going to come a couple of weeks later. So the emergency legislation had to be written in the way that it was written because it needed to go through the House in the way that it did. And I think that the way it was written made it palatable for all colours to be able to vote and say, yep, this is what we need to do. I have also had the unfortunate experience of negotiating with Jingye. So I understand the challenges that the government have had. When we talk about, and I'm sure you saw it in your planning committees, Rob, we had iterations 16, 17, 18 of what decarbonising Scunthorpe looked like over a period of about 6 months. So you think you get to a certain point with Jingye and then there is a complete about turn, no acknowledgement that that's what's going on, and then we're on a completely different path. I think the lesson should be that industries of strategic national importance shouldn't be left at the mercies of private equity, because that is what happens. And if the government had a stake and were able to make those decisions without having to pass legislation to be able to do them, then I'm sure that they could have done that in a much more managed way. We shouldn't have been tracking ships bringing iron ore into Immingham and seeing where are they, have they stopped, have they turned around, are we going to get it in time?
Have we paid for that?
Yeah.
Touch and go.
Yes. So I think the lesson is the sort of model like Sizewell C, where they've got an equity stake, they have a real big say in some of the negotiation we have about terms and conditions and what that's going to look like there. But being at the table at the right point is really crucial.
If I could just add, Chair, that there are private businesses who are seeking a relationship to work with government going forward that are knocking on my door, and I'm sure the union store and the government store now, who see this as a potential to work differently as a model to reduce the subsidy that the taxpayer is paying. That, you know, they're very focused on this. I think with the workers at the heart of that relationship, there are great models that, you know, across the world. But I think we do have to accept this is not an industry that won't require some level of intervention, whether it's the right policy encouraging procurement in the right or the best way. It's something that will need that for some time. And apart from anything else, there is scope to be able to grow the economy, certainly in North Lincolnshire, by using that site effectively going forward. But once this ownership thing, which has been the frustration for us all, once that's out the way, there will be no excuses for anybody not getting on with the job that we need to do to make sure we've got a sustainable steel industry. I just add that we have lots of steel sellers in our area as well, because they locate themselves quite appropriately next door to British Steel, and all of them are saying, this is the market saying, actually British Steel's got to start to produce cleaner steel. They're saying that because we're missing out on things now, because this is global. You know, the States did it years ago. There's some fascinating models about how the state has built a relationship with steel making, and we've just got to be very aware of it. But we just can't afford to keep missing markets, because apart from anything else, you know, that opportunity foregone will be lost forever, and we'll lose something that's critically important for not just our area. I mean, I'm here to pitch for North Lincolnshire, operating no illusion, but actually it will be the death knell of steel making, that we will be dependent on the rest of the world. You know, and that's a folly, isn't it? To think that things that we were so proud of making in this country, you know, that, you know, my dad told me from being this big that it was important that we keep making steel in our country, will be surrendered to China, to all the other developed nations that do have this understanding. And you can't be purists about this. You know, if you ask me, would I prefer us to operate purely on a capitalist model, then I have to say that my agenda would be. But you can't be a purist when you talk about steel making. You have to understand it's a strategic capability that is critically important for the nation. So I can't see any government, whoever they are, saying that they would just be able to walk away from steel making and Scunthorpe for a long time. If you didn't, you'd see what happened when communities have failed for generations. Those generations of families that lost their livelihoods that you would end up spending money on, but in a failure, you'd be paying for them not to work. And that in itself would be soul-destroying. That's not effective social policy from anybody's perspective. So
you almost got there, Rob.
Sorry.
Just the final question before we finish. And this may be crystal ball gazing, I don't know. But if you, with all your knowledge, all of you, how long do you think it will take to get from A to B so that we get the sort of full transition, whatever that is, blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces? How long do you think in reality that will take?
You are speaking about who's got the crystal ball here.
Yes.
I think one thing that we have to do is make sure we learn from what's happened down in South Wales about supporting people. Obviously, when that happened, Community opened the hub in Port Talbot, which is still there, and many of our members went through there for further education to get, you know, support and looking for other work. But we need to ensure that, and this is probably a cry, that through those processes we are part of everything that's happening and people listen to us, because we're the ones that know our members, we're the ones that know what they want and what they need.
What's going through my mind is obviously there's a lot of money going in at the moment from the taxpayer. What we want to get to a situation where the thing is sustainable, hopefully profitable. I mean, in rough, how long has it taken in Port Talbot to get to, and they're not still full in operation yet, are they?
Still not, and there's obviously difficulties with the grid, etc. Yeah. But, you know, what we would say is, you know, that to get those furnaces up and running, to get the product through, get the procurement in, because that procurement will add value to the taxpayer who's putting the money in, so it goes back. So it comes in a complete circle. You know, so the timescales, we need to ensure that we are working to those timescales, the company's working to those timescales, and everything's transparent. And as a tri-party, you know, sitting and speaking about making sure that those timelines are followed, because, as I say, we need to take lessons from what's happened around other places at the minute to ensure that we learn from them, not just blundering.
It's an impossible question to answer.
I don't think it's
it depends on the... Sorry, you go, Linda.
I think, you know, if you look at Port Talbot, for example, now that's been put back a year because of grid connection, so there has to be a lot of stuff done around about the infrastructure first, you know, because obviously the grid is not equipped to take it. So if you were looking at that type of scenario, and for that to apply at Scunthorpe, I think you would be looking about maybe 3 to 5 years. And that's been optimistic.
It does depend on the process that you decide to go through, because if you want to maintain steel making whilst you transition, which we believe is the only way to safeguard jobs, then it takes longer because there are more logistics to consider. You have to keep people safe while you're making steel and building new infrastructure projects. But I think that the steel industry has long been victim to short-term thinking. Whether that is government policy that thinks about electoral cycles rather than business cycles and energy prices and procurement, or investments and owners who are looking to come in, make money and leave. And so what I would urge governments and Westminster more broadly to think about is the long-term benefits of thinking beyond the next election and thinking about what does it need. So it could be a decade before we are making electric arc furnace steel in Scunthorpe, But if it takes that long to do it right and to safeguard those jobs and make the right investments and sort of stimulate growth in the area needed to sort of offset the jobs that will be lost through that process by creating new opportunities sort of ancillary to that, then that's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Charlotte. Rob, do you want to just add anything very briefly to that? Or is
My fear is it will be 5 years. It needs to happen in 3. I mean, I get the point about short-termism, but I think I have to say that Alan Bell and Lisa Colson, who are managing the site currently, are very aware of that. They're very, and they're working closely with government, but and they're doing a great job around that. But my genuine fear is that for us to keep the momentum that's needed to keep and the will around that, because my fear is that we will end up with people playing the politics and saying it's the subsidy cost a day and all that sort of stuff rather than. So I think it's got to happen in 3 years, otherwise the goodwill will be lost.
Can I thank you all very, very much. It's been a really, really interesting session. You've given us the benefit of all your knowledge. An uncorrected version of the transcript will be available in the next few days. If there's anything you've said that materially is wrong, we will study your evidence very carefully. We will produce a report, I suspect, with some recommendations which the government will look at and hopefully accept. But any of you who wish to stay for the next session, if you've got time, if you think you would be benefit, you're more than welcome to do so. Otherwise, can I thank you again very much indeed. We've appreciated your time here today.
Thank you.
Order.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the Public Accounts Committee. Monday the 22nd of June 2026. We now move into our second panel. We've just heard from an excellent panel of witnesses about the challenges facing the steel industry, and the NAO's report on this subject found that the Department of Trade and Business, or Business and Trade, DBT, moved quickly last April to prevent the closure of Scunthorpe blast furnaces and to avoid the potential economic shock, as we've just heard, if steel making ceased at the site. However, the report found that the intervention has no clear end date or exit strategy, with British Steel losing £1.4 million a day. Last week, DBT announced that as of the 18th of June, £555 million had been supplied to British Steel. So today we hope therefore be looking at the challenge to DBT on its preparedness for its intervention in British Steel and establish what lessons the department can learn from this. We'll also be examining the total cost of the intervention and its wider impact, as well as the future of British Steel and the possible nationalisation and consideration of the implications of the new steel strategy for a wider steel sector. So, could we please ask all of you to introduce yourself, perhaps starting with you, Amanda, introduce yourself and say who you are and what you do. Please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for the invite to the session. My name's Amanda Brooks. I'm the Interim Permanent Secretary at the Department of Business Trade, a position I took up at the start of April. David?
I'm David Bickerton. I'm the Chief Strategic Business Advisor to the department, and I am the Senior Responsible Officer for the steel sector and British Steel.
Thank you.
Neil?
Neil Johnson, I'm the Director for Materials, and steel is one of the materials that falls in my brief.
Thank you very much.
I'm Lorna Gratton. I'm a Director at UK Government Investments, and for much of the last year I've been seconded to DBT and working as a Site Director up at British Steel.
Thank you.
And Chair, if I may, if you know the steel programme well enough, Owen Parker is not with us here today. He is the director who has been responsible for steel transactions as part of our wider steel programme. Unfortunately, he's on leave this week and unable to join us, so we will do our best to cover his areas as well.
No doubt, with the galaxy of talent around you, you will do a very good job.
Fingers crossed.
So let's start with Clive Betts, please.
Okay, thanks, Chair. As I was indicating outside, you have a hard job to do to match what the unions gave to us earlier and the council leader in terms of their clarity of purpose on this matter. So there's hardly always been a clarity of purpose from the department, has there? I mean, this has gone on for quite a long time with no obvious clear end result, end game to achieve what was needed, and eventually having months of discussions and committees and working parties, suddenly emergency legislation will all come back on a Saturday to rush it through because it was desperately needed. How do we get into that position?
So perhaps I can start off. So the first thing I want to say actually is a big thank you to the National Audit Office for the work that they did on their investigation. As a new Interim Permanent Secretary, actually the report has been incredibly helpful for me as I have come to this topic fresh and as I tackled getting my head around it. I also just want to reflect, obviously, since the report was published, a number of different things have happened. Firstly, the government published the steel strategy, as you know, and indeed, as part of that strategy, it was clear two things. Firstly, that we would take some steel trade measures to deal with the global overcapacity that exists in the steel market, and indeed, the government announced, first in the King's Speech, and then subsequently introduced to the House, the Steel Nationalisation Bill. So a lot has been happening. I've asked David in a minute to give you a fuller timeline of how we got here. But the one thing I want to say is it was very important that we took those, we introduced the bill that we did, the what's known as SISMA, the Steel Industry Special Measures Act, and it was very kind of Parliament to come and deal with that bill in such a speedy way. We did not do that lightly. The action needed to be taken urgently rather than as an emergency. I think I would say something a little bit different, because that we had seen that the situation at British Steel was reaching a critical stage in terms of the availability of critical raw materials, and indeed the intention being signalled by the owner to close the site. And therefore we did need to act with pace and with urgency because the situation changed. However, we had been engaged with Jingyi as the owner for almost 2 years prior to that point over the transition towards decarbonised steel and over the future of the plant, and it was a step in that process. But David, say some more about those 2 years that got you to where we are today.
So I think it's right. I too am very grateful for the NAO report. The only bit I probably balked at a little bit, with apologies, Lena, is that it was an emergency. And I completely understand that recalling Parliament over the weekend gave a sense to emergency. I think the thing that's important to me is that before the Special Measures Act, what we were trying to do was to find a viable future for British Steel. And we were doing that in negotiations with Jingyi. After the Special Measures Act, we are still trying to find a viable future for British Steel. What happened over that very short period between probably the end of March and the 11th or 12th of April 2025 was that it became apparent to us that we were not going to be able to do a transaction with Jingyi, who was then the current owner. And the reason why, I mean, it's up to them to explain why that's the case, but the Secretary of State came to the conclusion that it would be no longer possible to do a deal with them. So what we were trying to do was to make sure that we did not have the unmanaged closure of the blast furnaces. Any future for British Steel involved, if it did involve closure of the blast furnaces, that had to be managed, and it had to be managed carefully with a view to money and operational requirements as well as supply, as well as customer demand. What CSMA did, the Special Measures Act, is it stopped the unmanaged closure of the blast furnaces, but we're still embarked on the same exercise, which is how do we find a future for British Steel? How do we establish what is a viable way for that business to run? And what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Special Measures Act is that we needed to, we did not take control of the company. We do not own the company. What we have is a very specific and relatively limited ability to give instructions, or for the Secretary of State to give instructions in order to keep the blast furnaces running. And yet, of course, after the Special Measures Act, we had no input from Jingyi about how to run the company. They, we asked them several times, what did they think, what would they like us to do? Did they have any suggestions about how the company should be run? And they made none. So as funder of the company, what we were required to do was actually set up all the internal governance and frameworks for spending money, which of course you correctly will challenge us on, to make sure that we were not only being careful with the money that we were spending, and I'm sure you'll have more detailed questions on the money to come, but that actually what we were doing was keeping in mind our primary goal, which was to get towards finding whether there is a viable future for British Steel. And actually the publication of the steel strategy, which makes clear that electric arc furnaces are likely to be the future, means that we are essentially trying to get into a position where we might be able to find another investor who might be able to come in on the same sort of deal as Jingyi.
Right, okay. I mean, I might ask why you weren't talking to other potential investors about electric arc before then. I mean, there's been quite a lot of discussion with Jingyi, and they clearly were not really committed for a long time. So,
but they're also the owner.
Yeah,
they were the owner then, and the decisions are for them, not for us, and they are the owner now. So I totally appreciate the point you're making, but it is quite difficult for the government to intervene where we are not the owner.
To intervene, but in March 2025, very shortly before, we were all called back on a Saturday to rush through a piece of legislation. The department concluded that there was no value for money case for the department to intervene.
I think we said it wasn't affordable, and I think when we were talking in that context, we were talking in managing public money terms, in that we did not have any budget for it.
Well, that's slightly different from not having a value for money case, because I understand the department needed a ministerial direction to actually go ahead.
So, do you want to talk about the direction?
Shall I? So, in making the decisions that we made, the advice was put by my predecessor to the then Secretary of State that given the pace at which we were needing to make decisions, that we were unable to complete the full due diligence that would enable us to make an assessment on either value for money grounds, because we did not have full access to all the relevant information for us to do that. And then the second ground was on feasibility, where, as you know, raw materials had been critically depleted inside British Steel, and bluntly, we simply did not know whether we would be able to source those materials in time to maintain the sustainability. So there was the point at which we sought the ministerial direction was on value for money and indeed on feasibility, but because we were unclear in the time available whether we could meet those tests.
Accounting officer at the end of the day, do you not accept there is a value for money case and was to actually do the intervention that was done?
At the point at which we made the intervention, we did not have the information to be able to make that judgment.
I believe there was an impact assessment earlier this year which concluded that there was a net social value.
So that's your position now, is it? You believe it's value for money?
But we were referring to the point at which the ministerial direction was sought.
But yeah, during that period of time as well, there was no attempt to look at the national security implications of this. And with our previous panel, right across all the trade unions, the council leader, very strongly arguing about not merely the impact on workers, the impact on the community, about the national impact of not having a steel industry. This was not an issue, was it, when you looked at it? Why?
Actually, if I may, one of the reasons or one of the stated aims by the Secretary of State about why we introduced the Special Measures Act was in order to carry out a national security assessment. That has been carried out and we keep it under constant review. It's designated secret, so we can't talk about it in this forum, but we did share it with the NAO and they reflected that, I believe, in their paper.
It's difficult to see why we can't talk about it. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? We've got to produce weapons from steel. We've got a whole range of other industries that rely on steel.
I think there are sensitivities here that I can see.
Yeah.
I think perhaps.
But the key is we are making that assessment on national security, and also the grounds or the context in which we are making that assessment is constantly changing as well. So it is important that the assessment exists, which it does, but also it is important that it is constantly reviewed to ensure that it reflects the circumstances in which we are in. The national security circumstances, I personally would say, are much more acute today than they were in 2023 due to the fact that there is now two wars around the European borders, which was not, sadly, only one war at that point.
Just back to David, if I could, just in terms of the intervention itself, were there any alternatives you looked at, or did you look at them all and conclude that none of them were realistic?
We looked at 5 options. Essentially what happened is that we had been making offers and Jingye had been declining them over a period of time through different administrations. They had been signalling to us for a period of time that the operating costs, particularly carbon costs and energy prices, were a big issue for them. And they kept asking us whether we could fund their operating expenditure, which for us was a red line, but of course would become moot if we did do a deal with them, because what they chose to allocate any state funding towards would be up to them. What we looked at was when we made an offer on, I think, the 25th of March, we made an offer to them of £500 million, and they declined it the same day. I think the next day they announced a redundancy consultation, and then in the days following that, what we discovered was that they were not taking on board their shipments of raw materials, and they were either sending those raw materials off to China or declining to accept them. So what we did is we looked at 5 options. Up till that date, the Secretary of State's preference had been to do a deal with these with Jingye. We looked at 5 options. Do nothing is always the first option you look at. We looked at whether we could fund their raw materials for 3 months, and we engaged with them on that one. We looked at whether we could do a consensual purchase. We looked at whether we could do a nationalisation, and I've run out at 4.
Civil Contingencies Act.
Yes, and whether we could use existing legislation. We discovered we couldn't use existing legislation. We took advice from the Attorney General. And what we engaged with the company to do was we said, we will pay for a proportion of your raw materials because we didn't want to get into the situation we ultimately got into. Eventually, the talks, if you like, broke down, and I think that's the point at which the Secretary of State came to the conclusion, in my view correctly, that there was no deal to be done, because we had offered to pay for all of their raw materials, and they were going to take the proceeds of selling their product. And we had asked for restrictions around disposal of assets and repatriation of cash to outside this jurisdiction. That was not acceptable to Jingye, and so I think we did, in fact, come to the conclusion that there was no deal to be done.
So the question that was shouting at me as I was reading the NA report was, why didn't you, when you took those powers on that Saturday, include powers to nationalise it? Because that was over a year ago. We might be further ahead now if you'd taken those powers then. So was it practically impossible in the time available to produce a bill that would include powers, if you wished, to nationalise it then? Or what was the problem? Or didn't you think about it then?
We did contemplate nationalisation. We were providing submissions to the Secretary of State and the ministerial team from September, October 2024 about routes to nationalisation. I think we felt that, the Special Measures Act is a temporary provision. The simplest way to end it, of course, would be for the owner to say to us, okay, I'm going to run the company properly. We would look towards running the blast furnaces on a consistent basis. And I think we felt that, particularly at the pace at which we were doing it, and noticing that there's been quite extensive debate about the proposed nationalisation bill, and I believe it's in the discussion at the House of Lords at the moment. I think we felt that at that pace, it wasn't likely to be acceptable to actually nationalise something, because one of the crucial things for us that we were taking into consideration is that Jingye have spent a lot of money on this site. They have made unfortunately for them, they've made a very bad business decision, so that the company is currently worthless. It is not investable, but they have spent an awful lot of money. And what we would be very nervous about doing is nationalising willy-nilly companies, because I think that would cause concern, not just in relation to our relationship with China. It would cause challenges for getting in external investment from other countries. And so it's been very important to us all along that we treat Jingye with respect and in the way that any other international investor would expect to be treated in the UK.
And if I might just add, as I said earlier, at the point at which we were making the decision to pursue CISMA, we did not have enough information about the situation inside the company. So for us to leap to the decision that nationalisation was the only option would have been premature. And as David said, given that we needed to have better information about the situation as we found it, in practice, even after the introduction of CISMA, we continued to have negotiations with Jingye about the potential purchase of British Steel. It wasn't that we have gone straight from CISMA to a decision to introduce the Steel Nationalisation Bill. There have been ongoing discussions and negotiations to find other solutions. Introducing the Steel Nationalisation Bill is a last resort. But as it's a last resort and as it's such a significant move, it is also incredibly important that it goes through due parliamentary process and due parliamentary scrutiny to ensure that the approach has been tested rigorously in the way that Parliament is here to do. So it is extremely important. It is moving through both houses relatively quickly. As you know, it's had its second reading last week in the House of Lords. And indeed, it is still the government's view that we would like to see the passage of the bill complete speedily to enable us to make recommendations, in my case, to the Secretary of State about the next steps, which may be to recommend nationalisation if it is in the public interest. But we do have to go through that due process and also have the information on which to be able to make those decisions sensibly and advise ministers appropriately.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Sarah Green, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to turn to follow up on some of the questions that we've already had around monitoring the risks in the lead up to the intervention. And I'm just going to quote from paragraph 8 in the NAO report, which says that Jingye had been clear about British Steel's financial and operational challenges. In July 2024, Jingye told DBT its financial position was unsustainable and that it would have to close the blast furnaces. I'm keen to understand that given those warning signs were there for some time, I accept, Amanda, that you've said we did not have enough information about the situation. I'm keen to understand what contingency plans the department was putting in place in terms of, I don't know, powers or funding options. It sounds like it kind of snowballed at you at the back end of one particular...
I don't think that's quite right in terms of snowball. As David has already explained, there was an ongoing series of discussions that were happening between us and Jingye that started back in 2022 about the electric arc furnaces and their desire to move towards transition towards electric arc furnaces, but where their own approach that they wanted to take to this transition did change over a number of conversations that others around this table were involved in rather than me. And therefore it was an iterative process with different information coming to light, and also where Jingye approached us on a number of different occasions for different levels and types of funding, which we entered into discussions with them on, but where ultimately they reached decisions not to accept the proposals that were being made by the government. So I understand how you feel it has snowballed, but it has been a long, concerted, involved and iterative process that we have gone through.
Plans in place in case of things not, because I'm not sure we can see that there evidence that there were contingency plans in place.
So as David has just said, I mean, we were advising ministers back in the September before on the different options that were available to us, and indeed we were looking at some of those options in detail. For example, the work that the option Neil kindly remembered on whether we could use the Civil Contingencies Act. So we were working through those, but the primary focus remained on trying to reach the right solution with Jingye. Do you want to add?
Well, the only thing I would add is that actually you could have picked an earlier date for when they started threatening closure. So I think looking at my notes here, they first threatened job closures in January 2023. Now, if somebody keeps saying to you that their business model is unsustainable, and then month after month, year after year, they're still saying that it's unsustainable, I think we were entitled to be slightly sceptical about it. I think our primary contingency plan was actually to pay for their raw materials, because from an economically rational investor, you would think that would mean that they were bearing no cost of, well, they were bearing the cost of running the business, but one of the major costs of their business was being assumed by us. So I think we thought that was a good defence. The other thing we had is all along we had EY on standby, ready to step in if necessary. And then I think, I mean, I can run through the things we did do afterwards, all of which I think worked. You know, we stood up a team very quickly. We got a director on site that day to talk to the staff. We were ably supported by Lorna and her predecessor, who went up to be the site director. And also, to be fair, we were extremely well supported by the British Steel management team.
And it's worth saying, when we made the assessments against the Managing Public Money test, the 4 accounting officer test, one of the tests that we felt we did comfortably pass was propriety, because we were ready to take some of these actions, that we had the ability to bring EY in, that we had the budget set up inside the department, that we were able to surge colleagues from around the department in to strengthen the team for a very different circumstance to where we'd been.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Matt, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon. This question's to all of you, if I may. What are the main lessons that this intervention has taught you that you would apply to future interventions, either in the steel sector or indeed other sectors that were facing distress?
Thanks very much. We've talked about this quite a lot, as I'm sure you would hope and anticipate. So firstly, it's worth reflecting that DBT has a centre of expertise on economic shocks, which we've had in place for some time. And what do? They do a number of things. So firstly, they help make sure that we have the capability inside the organisation, that we're able to deploy on short-term contingency basis when situations are beginning to emerge. They also operate a series of playbooks that they have developed over time. Now, you all appreciate every circumstance that we face is rather different to itself, but there are certain common elements and common options and frameworks that we need to consider, that they have crystallised into playbooks that we use and adapt and learn from as we develop over time, and also which we share more broadly across government. Of course, they also do quite a bit of horizon scanning, so that's both in terms of looking at public data sources so that we can get ahead and have the warning signs. Obviously, our sector teams do a considerable amount of sector engagement and often are an excellent source of concern that they want to make sure that we're aware of, and we work with other government departments. So that is existing expertise that is there and that we're perpetually learning and strengthening as we go. When we step back, though, and we look at what we have learned from this particular example, I think a number of things come to light which were reflected in the NAO report. So firstly, can we intervene earlier, even earlier? Can we get upstream of the problems? And actually, that's one of the things that we thought about very consistently. And in the current economic context in which we're operating, we had advised ministers, and you will have seen that announcements have been made on both chemicals and ceramics sectors, partly to help us to get upstream of the problem. And if you want to know more about that, please ask Neil, because he did all the work on it. But also, we've been reflecting a lot about the criteria that we use for assessing this and strengthening the framework that we use, and I'm beginning to use this in a very different way to how we have used in the past. That helps us and inform our advice that we give to ministers on whether we should intervene or shouldn't. And again, that's something that we have been using in practice over recent months. It's all on Neil. Again, Neil has been using it specifically in the cases of NSUS and Grangemouth, where, again, we have been using that framework to help underpin the assessment that we have made on the case for intervention. Of course, you will understand that sometimes applying that framework suggests that we shouldn't intervene, which is information we don't tend to share, given the sensitivity of that to do it, but we are using that framework. There are other areas. I mean, obviously, we've heard loud and clear your concerns about exit strategies. How do we ensure that we think about that more concertedly at an earlier stage? I would say I think this particular circumstance, maybe it's not quite unique, but it's certainly highly unusual that we have ended up both taking recalling Parliament to take legislation at very short notice in a single day to enable us to act, but also in introducing the Steel Nationalisation Bill. All of this feels like a very exceptional circumstance that we've moved into. There's more, but would you like Neil to say anything more on his application of our lessons learned?
Yes, that would be really kind, absolutely. And then, Neil, I do have a question for you as well afterwards.
Oh, lucky you.
If you don't cover it in what you're about to say.
Over to you.
Well, I mean, there's not much to say other than what Amanda's already said, really. But I mean, I suppose the interesting thing is on a couple of those cases Amanda mentioned, NSUS and Grangemouth, we were able to reach a financial settlement with the companies in question. We were, of course, thinking about national security. We were, of course, thinking about, critical products. We were also, of course, thinking about what we would have to do in terms of our team to make sure we were ready to deal with the consequences if we weren't able to reach settlement. So we were trying to learn those lessons. I mean, the other thing is, as Amanda has already mentioned, I think the NAO report talked about getting upstream, and I think that has been very important to our Secretary of State and something we've really tried to do, which is to say, look, some of these companies have common themes that we can see they're going to cause problems. They're highly energy intensive, highly trade exposed. We have spiking energy prices again because of what's going on in the Middle East. So we can see that's going to cause problems. We know which sectors it's going to be in because we're talking to them all the time. And that's where the chemicals package and the ceramics package recently came from, was we can see it's going to ripple through and cause us trouble, so let's get ahead of it and get the money ready to go. and we are now talking to the companies that we know are critical in those sectors, so that we can get to them very quickly if we need to.
That's great, thank you. And really interesting to see that sort of application of it to ceramics and chemicals, as you said. In terms of the steel sector, though, is there does the intervention tell you useful stuff about what's really needed for a viable UK sector?
Yeah, so I suppose we have a lot of information about the steel sector. We are in arrangements with Tata already. Obviously, we get lots of financial information from British Steel. We can see that you can create a business environment that means these sectors can survive and prosper, but it requires heavy lifting, right? And that's what we've been doing. We've been trying to create that business environment. That is things like the CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism that we will be delivering in a couple of years' time. That's the trade measures that Amanda talked about. That is implementing the supercharger scheme to reduce energy costs, which has just been increased. The network element of that has been increased to 90%. So steel companies now get essentially almost wholesale energy prices on electricity, and also seeing where our natural advantages are in the steel sector. So we have abundant scrap metal in the UK. We have 11 million tonnes of scrap. Most of that is exported. We do not really have much coal and iron ore left in the UK commercially available, right, at the quality we need. That tells you that essentially this sector needs to transition to a decarbonised electric arc furnace scrap route, and then it can have a viable future. And that is what our steel strategy has been about. How do you create a sector where essentially we don't have to do these interventions again, because it should be a profitable business environment.
And if I might just add to that, as Neil's just said, the work that the department has done and some really strong cross the department internally, but also across government work in producing that steel strategy should not be underestimated. It is very clear that it's there to focus on how do we build a viable future for steel sector in the UK, given it is so important to so many sectors, particularly our industrial strategy 8 sectors, not all of them, but some of them certainly more so than others, but also in that context of national security that Mr. Betts was mentioning earlier. We've set out a clear plan in terms of how we're aiming to rebuild the sector, how we're trying to build towards domestic share being around 40 to 50% of domestic demand, which it has been the case in the past, although it's around 30% today. But also, how do we position the UK as a world leader in clean, modern steel production? So the steel strategy, I think, is a really important part of the overarching framework. As you know, as you go through the steel strategy, that looks at various different aspects of the business environment that we think we need to address to ensure that that works for all sectors, all companies, working across the sector, not just British Steel or Tata, but looking at the sector as a whole. And Neil's just managed to mention all of those, but not quite all of them. He missed out skills, but only just.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and the previous panel
need to keep moving.
Sorry, we're really singing the praises of the strategy. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. For the purposes of this question, Neil, let's assume that Parliament fully enacts the nationalisation bill as it is at the moment, and decides to use its powers. What are the next steps, briefly then, to transitioning this business to have a viable future?
David will have views on this as well, but the steel strategy sets out that broadly the UK steel sector needs to decarbonise, needs to go down to the electric arc furnace route, but that needs to be a managed transition, so that is not slamming the blast furnaces shut today. That's working out how you look after the workforce, how you keep the customers, and these are very big projects, right? These are very big capital projects, very big HR projects, and supporting the workers and the company through that is a very important thing to do. They are also very expensive projects. These are multi-billion-pound projects, and I should say no decisions have been taken on that, and the work is ongoing. The other thing to say, perhaps before I hand over to David, is that essentially, like with Tata, we expect the company to come up with the solution, right? So this needs to be a company-led, and they need to come to us with the proposals as Tata did. So perhaps I'll hand over to David.
Yes, thank you. So one of the key things for us is that we need to get the benefit of private sector and commercial experience in running a company. So we are very keen that if you fast forward, the legislation has been passed, the public interest test has been met, the statutory instrument has gone through, what we would look to do is to appoint a board in order to make sure that we have, in order to assess whether there is actually a pathway to the future viability for the company, which is aligned with the steel strategy. We're not just looking at the steel strategy, because the steel strategy is part of the industrial strategy. We are also looking at economic security. We're also looking through the lens of jobs and regional prosperity, as well, of course, of decarbonisation. But essentially what we would do on that first day is we would set up the governance for a government-owned company, and we would get a lot of help from UKGI in doing that, because they're the experts on that. What we would try to do is to set the objectives for a company like that, so that we set the objectives and then we use the people who've got the real skill in running those sorts of companies to actually deliver it. What we think that would likely involve, given that our stated aim is still, and we call it the pathway, which is finding the way to a sustainable, investable future for British Steel, we would continue to stabilise the workforce and operations. We would be establishing whether the company can get into the sort of shape that is necessary to deliver what would be a very complex both transformation project to move from the old blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, whether they've got the capability to go from, whether they've got the capability to do that transformation project, but also when is the best time to do it, because it is a hugely impactful event in Scunthorpe if you were, when you would decide to move from blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, and of course it's got huge economic consequences. Around the team composition, Jingye essentially ran this company very, very closely. A lot of stuff went back to China. So with full respect to the great team of British Steel management who are on the ground there now, there is some capability gaps within the business about whether it be able to do it. And, of course, in order to make sure that we are not the sole funder of this, we need to make sure that we can create an investable proposition out of this company. Now, to be clear, it's not investable at the moment, and so what we need to get a board in there who can actually get it to a position where internationally credible investors would say, okay, I see the steel strategy, I see the management team in British Steel, I see the market in the UK, and therefore I can see an investment opportunity for me.
David, with great respect, that was great.
So Geoffrey, I'm really sorry. I just had one point that David missed that I think is really important, which is we would, of course, as is foreseen under the Nationalisation Bill, also appoint an independent valuer of the business to enable us to reach a satisfactory conclusion of the relationship with Jingye. Of course, we recognise it's a loss-making business. It has been for many years. It may be that an independent valuer says there is no value in the business, but obviously we respect the commitments that we have made and we respect the investment that comes into the UK from other countries, and we would wish to make sure that we handle that appropriately and in line with our obligations. So I don't want to forget what is a very important part of this process, should it unfold, which is that we need to ensure that we part ways with Jingye appropriately using independent valuation, which we will abide by.
I can understand why you put that on the record. I don't want to pressure any more on that. What I simply want to say is that this business is losing 1.4 million a day. The table 12, figure 12, page 38 in the report says that by June, 30th of June, you will have put in 641 million. So timetables. I mean, I really want to try and understand from this afternoon's hearings what you're envisaging the taxpayer is going to have to put into this whole thing to get the business into this transition phase.
So thank you. Let me start, and then I will be turning to Lorna, who is very close to the financial aspects of this. So you referred earlier, you're correct, that as of today we have made payments to British Steel of around £555 million. That did a number of things. It enabled us to replenish working capital and raw materials, both of which, as you have heard, were running significantly lower than was appropriate. It's enabled us to support British Steel to fill some key gaps in the workforce and indeed to make a pay rise for workers who had not had one since 2023, but also to ensure that we were transitioning people out of temporary contracts into permanent contracts. The most important bit of money that we have spent, though, has been on health and safety. As you know, it's a high-risk site. I don't know how many of you have visited, but it is a high-risk site, and the concerns that we had in our arrival on site were very much centred on the health and safety situation that we encountered, where we felt there had been underinvestment and where health and safety did not meet the requirements that we felt was necessary. We have a new health and safety director who is, I can confirm, absolutely passionate about protecting the people on the site, and I commend him for his passion and commitment, but that has been absolutely critical. At the moment, we are anticipating that this process that David has just set out will still take some time. I don't know. I don't think any of you can yet tell me when we will reach royal assent, and therefore when we will be able to advise ministers on next steps and appoint the board and so forth.
Assuming that you've got.
But assuming that, we will need to give the board time to work through the plan. We have provision in the budget for the department for a similar level of funding this year as was to last, although I would very much hope it would be less than that, but please do not hold me to that. But we are prepared for the year ahead. Lorna, do you want to add?
And only to say that not all of the money that we've put into the company so far is funding losses. So some of the money remains in the company in the form of cash, inventory, receivables, unsurrendered carbon allowances. So a proportion of that money is still there, and we would expect to continue to still be there while the company continues to operate. Ultimately, though, however, as you've heard, the company is structurally unprofitable under its current configuration. So we would expect the company to continue to be loss-making on an ongoing basis whilst it continues to operate with its blast furnace and mill configuration that it currently has.
I'm getting great answers, but I'm not getting the answers to my question. I really want to get from this session how much money you think the taxpayer is going to have to sink into this project before you get the full implementation, and how long will it take? We began to explore that with the last field of witnesses, but surely you've been thinking about this for quite a long time, really. It's not just suddenly sprung on you. So what's the answer to my questions?
I don't think we can put a hard timeline on it, because we need to take control of the business if that's what ministers decide is appropriate and the public interest test is met. We need to appoint a board, and they need to work through the transformation plan that Lorna has just set out is going to be necessary for this to be cease to be a loss-making company and be a viable company going forward. You have heard us all talk about that is the long-term objective. It remains the long-term objective, but this is not going to be solved at enormous pace just because of the complexity of what we're doing in understanding the changes that are going to be needed. Shifting from two blast furnaces, both of which are over 70 years old, and installing new electric arc furnaces, if that is the transformation path that a new board decides is the right way forward, is also going to take a little bit of time for us to navigate.
You're not necessarily committed to that path?
It's not a decision for me, it's a decision for the board.
And ultimately, just to add to that, it will be a decision for ministers how they want to get there. So the cost will partly be driven by how they choose to operate the site between now and if they acquire the site and the electric arc furnace being built, and then there will also be a variable as to how long the construction takes, which is reliant on a number of factors, some of which are within government's control but not all of them, and it's dependent on having a grid connection to run the arc furnace. It's contingent on being able to commission one, purchase one, get the relevant studies done, and there's quite a large window within that which that could happen and be completed.
I think there's still lots of unanswered questions there. I might come back to this if we've got time. Otherwise, we will pursue it in writing. But Sarah, please.
Thank you. Can I ask about the impact this is having on your wider budget as a department? You've already mentioned the 8 growth sectors. What impact is this having on what you're able to do for those 8 sectors, for example?
So I think it is important that we are pursuing this programme to support the 8 sectors. Not all of them, as I mentioned earlier, are dependent on steel as part of their supply chain, but a number of them, whether it's defence or advanced manufacturing, absolutely, or clean power for that matter, absolutely have steel as part of their requirements, and therefore having that security and resilience of supply is incredibly important, and it's why steel is described inside the industrial strategy as a foundational sector that matters. In terms of funding, which I think is what you're actually getting at, so let me answer that question specifically. In 25-26, in the financial year 25-26, the vast majority of the funding for British Steel actually came from the Treasury Reserve. So that was accounted for about 358 million of the money that was spent supporting British Steel in that financial year. And we had agreed with the Treasury that funding that came from, underspends that emerged during the financial year would be repurposed to support British Steel. So in this case, ultimately that was around 95 million of our underspends was repurposed from supporting other projects into funding of British Steel over that year. For this financial year, it's a little bit different. It is set out in our budget separately. So there is a clear budget line that's broadly similar to the one that we operated under for payments to British Steel last year, and where we're not anticipating a call on the reserve. So we have not had to make any hard trade-offs, if I can put it that way, because underspends emerged last year and because of the Treasury's support through access to the reserve.
You haven't had to cut anything that you were planning to do, for example, for those 8 growth sectors because of this intervention?
So I would frame it slightly differently. So if I look at the 2 biggest things that we made changes to enable us to surrender those underspends. So one was our digital data and technology programme inside the department, where we reprofiled the programme and made some, reworked the work programme, and that generated some underspend that was deployed to support British Steel. We also had some unallocated funding as part of our spending review to support some of the industrial strategy sectors, but have not been allocated to sectors, so specifically professional and business services. And then a third instance was one of the advanced manufacturing programmes had some underspends due to the fact that the project proposals did not meet the value for money assessments, and therefore it was appropriate to redeploy that funding to support British Steel.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sarah. Clive, please.
Well, I can just look at the steel sector now, but it seems as though the answer is, well, this money was just lying around and we haven't missed it.
Well, that's not strictly true. It was the result of some considered decisions. I mean, I would say DBT's, as you will all know, as this committee and as the NAO will report, the NAO colleagues will also know, our spending can be quite unpredictable due to kind of profiling of spend that happens over the year, and also the speed with which it's drawn down by different organisations to whom we provide funding. So I wouldn't say it was lying around. We are fortunate that in the case of 25-26 that we had access to the Treasury Reserve, and where we had made a commitment to the Treasury that we would utilise underspends to support British Steel rather than calling on the Reserve. But as you could see, the balance was that the Reserve funded the vast majority of the intervention we made in 25-26, supported by 95 million that came from emerging underspends.
Right, but there was 2.5 billion on one side, wasn't there, to support steel. That was a wider support for the industry. How much will actually go on at the Scunthorpe works, and therefore what will be left for the rest of the steel industry?
So I think it's quite hard to be precise on that, given what we have said in terms of the future profile. However, a substantial chunk of that money has gone, as you will already know, to the National Wealth Fund to support steel as one of its 5 strategic priorities, so supporting green steel. Other funding has been invested, so for example, the work that we are doing with other steel companies at the moment. The funding, though, for Tata to move to electric arc furnaces outside that 2.5 billion, as indeed is the money that the MOD have spent supporting Sheffield Forge Masters. So I'm afraid I can't give you a precise figure. We are tracking it very carefully, though.
I think it'd be helpful to know, because obviously you've got Liberty, you've got the steelworks in Rotherham and Stocksbridge, where currently people are being furloughed, they're working about part-time, which seems an awful waste of money when you've got plant and equipment there, but you're employing people to sit at home. So where are we in the terms of the money that you have available to look at the future of the industry? Surely a lot of it's going to Scunthorpe and less must be left for the rest of it.
Well, obviously, a significant proportion of money is going to Scunthorpe. We've already set that out. Of course, we are working very carefully with other steel companies who might need different forms of support. Do you want to talk about specialty steels?
Happy to update on Liberty. I mean, it's a process being run by the official receiver, the court-appointed official receiver. The official receiver had chosen a preferred bidder. That period has now lapsed, actually, and we are essentially working with the official receiver because some of the bidders have asks of government to take over and run the site. But at the minute, it looks like it should be able to return to the private sector.
In the meantime, you're funding it.
In the meantime, we are, as is the agreement with the courts and the official receiver, we provide funding to keep it running as it was before it went into that process. The staff were already furloughed by the GFG group before the court intervened.
Right. So you're funding Liberty on an ongoing basis. You've got no control over it. You're just putting money in. So you've no idea how much is that going to cost the taxpayer?
Well, at this precise moment in time, we are in commercial negotiations. Well, the official receiver is in commercial negotiations. We're providing funding to the official receiver whilst they are going through that process. But as Neil has just said, we remain hopeful that that will return to the private sector.
Right. Any costs in the meantime before a hopeful purchase takes place is going to come out of the 2.5 billion, is it?
Right.
Yeah. So that's a limited pot, is it? What happens if it runs out?
Well, as you know, we will be going into a new spending review period and therefore we will need to assess the future requirements that we might have as an organisation and address those through the normal processes of spending review.
Simple question then. Is the money being spent at Scunthorpe, however important, and we accept it is, going to affect your ability to support any other parts of the steel sector?
I don't think I can answer that very clearly at the moment. At the moment, we are able to fund the support to Scunthorpe, as I've explained, to British Steel, as I have explained, because that is factored into the department's budget for this year. At the moment, the work that we're doing with specialty steels is creating a pressure, but we are managing that inside the department. What that means longer term depends on the direction of travel of those negotiations.
Right, but I think most people who work in those industries, the communities there, will not be terribly reassured about the possibility you could run out of money and not be able to support them.
Well, obviously we would approach the Treasury and have discussions with the Treasury about the funding requirements that we will generate. We are, of course, talking to the Treasury at every stage in the steel strategy overall, but also the constituent parts. So they are fully cited on the financial challenges that are emerging, the financial pressures that are emerging on the department's budget.
Again, you've got a strategy. It can't be a strategy which says, oh, we might run out of money and not been able to deliver it, is it? Can it?
Well, no strategy has limitless funds, I would politely say.
Right. Trying to get out of you what the future is for the rest of the steel industry. Because it's no use saving one bit if you can't save the rest. Now, it's a strategy for the whole industry. Are you confident that you can deliver the strategy? To deliver the strategy, surely you've got to deliver the funding to meet it.
So I'm confident we can deliver the strategy. I think the point where I am taking a slightly more nuanced view is I am not clear on the extent to which government funding will be needed for every aspect of that strategy, given a proportion of the steel sector remains in the private sector and will continue to remain in the private sector, and indeed where we are working, as David has said, to work with British Steel to ensure this is an investable proposition in which the private sector are also invested longer term. But you are talking to us at a point in a process where many factors are unknown, as Lorna has just set out, including some of the potential costs of some of the choices that will need to be made by different boards in the case of British Steel and also in the case of Speciality Steel, the conversations that are unfolding that the official receiver is leading.
You have to update the committee in a few weeks, months' time?
We will update you as soon as we have a substantive update to provide.
Thank you, Clive. Matt, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to direct this question to Mr. Bickerton, if I may. And it relates to advisors. So why did you need to spend so much on advisors to help implement the intervention? What actions are you taking to reduce that? And why are advisor costs not treated as part of the loan to British Steel as other costs are? Thank you.
So we have two main buckets of advisory cost, which is the support that EY have been giving to us on the site. And the other bucket is Ashurst, who've been giving us legal advice. Both of them have been procured through the government commercial function, so they're operating on the panel rates that are agreed through that competitive competition. Both of them stood up at very, very short notice to support us, and I would say the advice that they've given us has been very valued and very timely. The question, as always with advisors, is whether it is better for us or British Steel to procure through experts or to hire our own. We did not take this decision based on departmental headcount considerations. So what we did was we essentially looked at where do we get the best advice for the money in this specific area. And so what we and I know that you as a committee have looked at the value for money of procuring external advisors. We get excellent advice from the government legal department. But on the technical, particularly the international angles that we engage with Jingye, we think that the global expertise of those firms is better, to be frank, than we could buy ourselves. So what have we done in order to try and reduce that cost? Well, we do have frequent meetings under the panel arrangements where we challenge them on their costs and the number of people involved. We have reduced quite significantly the number of people working for us or working on this project through EY in order to keep costs down. Why is it not added to the loan? I might pass over to Lorna in the hope that she would know that.
Thank you, David. So I think EY have been doing a number of different things for us on site and as part of the contract. Part of that, certainly at the beginning, was filling capability gaps in the organisation. As Amanda said at the start, a lot of the senior people at British Steel were Chinese nationals. It was run as part of a group, and quite a lot of the functions were actually not performed within the company in Scunthorpe. That includes kind of some of the treasury, some of the finance type functions, and so there was a sort of genuine gap in capability in the company, which EY have been fulfilling. British Steel has actually been building up its own capability over time in order to fill that gap. And similarly on the health and safety side, when we started funding the company, I believe there was only around 6 employees in the health and safety team. You would expect it typically to be more of a team of around 20 or 30, which is I think the size of the team when Jingye first acquired the company in 2019. So there's clearly quite a big capability gap there. EY were initially providing support in that space as well. They also, again, that has now been built up in the British Steel team. As Amanda said, they've got a new health and safety director, and they are making massive strides and progress in that space. One of the other functions EY does for us, though, is they provide independent advice into the department. You know, none of us are kind of executives of British Steel. We do not health and safety practitioners, and they provide an independent view to us. And where they're providing an independent view, it is important that they are contracted to us and that they are paid by us, so that there is no kind of perception that they could be conflicted by having an obligation to the company as well. So I actually think it's quite important that they have been contracted by us rather than by British Steel, but that is changing over time, and the EY support on site to British Steel is now actually very, very limited.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Come on then, look at the issue of the blast furnaces. You're basically supporting a steel plant with blast furnaces, which everyone accepts are not the future. Does it feel very frustrating that you're pouring money into something which is going to end, and probably end as soon as you would like?
So it is really important that we continue to have primary steelmaking capability in the UK. That was a decision ministers made, and is partly behind the intervention originally. It does worry me that the blast furnaces are as old as they are, and therefore their operational reliability is not always as sound as we would like it to be in terms of their ability to produce steel consistently. One of the things that the NAO report says is there is a capacity there to deliver 300 million tonnes. In practice, we have not seen anything approaching that for some years now. So I think 1.7 million in, is that right, Lorna, in 2023? Have I got that wrong?
I actually don't know, I'm sorry.
Okay. She doesn't, but it is considerably smaller than the 3 million that the NAO reports referred to. However, it is the primary steelmaking capability that we have. Therefore, it is important for us to continue it, and that's why the government has taken the actions that it has and has intervened in the way that it has to stabilise that the operations of British Steel over the years that we are doing that. It matters. But of course, we need to make sure we're transitioning to an appropriate future.
Right, so mentioning primary steel making, why is that term so important? I mean, many countries don't have a primary steel making facility, do they, capacity?
I don't think there's many. I'm going to defer to somebody who definitely knows. Neil, if you don't realise this is coming your way, I'll be surprised. But my fundamental understanding is there are very few major economies that do not have that capability. For us to not have it in the UK would be anomalous, with many of whom we would consider to be our global comparators in this space. But also I think it goes to the points that you were raising earlier around security of supply, resilience, and indeed national security. But I'm definitely going to defer to Neil.
So if we were to shut the blast furnaces down today, we would be the only G20 country not to have iron making capability, which is what we call primary steel making capability. There are two questions, I think. The first is, can you make all of the steel products you need to make for your country through the electric arc furnace route? We commissioned the Materials Processing Institute to answer that question first, and they definitively said the answer is yes. So the first thing is you can go the electric arc furnace route and make defence steels for the renewable industry, steels for your food packaging industry. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, though, you do need a small supply of iron to make all the grades. And then the question there is, can you secure that iron at all times when you need it, and can you ensure you have secure supply? And so that is what takes the time, is you have to do the transition to the electric arc furnace while ensuring you have supply of the what's called either hot briquetted iron HBI or direct reduced iron DRI. So when you go down the EAF route, you need that secure supply of the other product. There is plenty in the world. It tends to be made either in places like Trinidad or in the Middle East.
So you need primary steel because of the quality of the steel.
You need a very small quantity to make some types of products. Actually, nothing to do with defence. You need a very small quantity of iron to essentially make food packaging mostly.
Right. Why we're looking at electric arc then? Are we looking at DRI as an alternative?
Yeah, so the steel strategy says the government would be keen to see a DRI plant in the UK that can be made economically viable. So that would be what we'd like to see. If we are not able to make that economically viable because it either requires very large volumes of methane or very large volumes of hydrogen, which unfortunately today we don't have economically, we hope to have in the future, then in that gap you need to have very secure supplies from reliable allies of DRI.
Right, so that is the future, is it? You can make it work, DRI. That's what the plan is, to try and get there.
The strategy says you would like to get to a world where you could have a HBI or DRI plant in the UK, but that requires very large quantities of hydrogen to make it in a net zero way.
So have you got a plan, a business model about how you want to get there, even if you're not sure you can get there at stage?
I wouldn't say a business model, but we've essentially done the analysis of how you can do it, and it's essentially a question of what is the cost availability of methane or hydrogen. If you were going to make DRI in Europe, this is the place you would make it. You would make it in the UK.
Right.
And I would add that hydrogen is one of the other strategic priorities for the National Wealth Fund.
Right. I'm just looking at ITM Power in my constituency, which is one of the leading developers of green hydrogen, so I hope you're looking at their capacity and the capacity of other similar companies as well.
Well, clearly National Wealth Fund are looking for opportunities in that space, and as Neil has said, we have been looking through what are the opportunities in that space as well.
Yeah, so a couple of questions, if I may, around, first of all, the current estimate. So last year, from press reports, the estimate was 1 billion. The latest report's 1.5 billion by 2028. So obviously the estimates have changed and increased. Obviously the company itself, net liabilities of 788 million, intergroup debt of 736 million. So that's the Chinese company in question. So can I first of all just question, in terms of the certainty around that 1.5 billion mark, I understand that an independent valuer will be appointed to determine compensation. So that 1.5 billion isn't the total figure, is it? It's subject to increases if the independent valuer were to come in and...
I'm sorry, I'm struggling to recognise the 1.5 billion figure. Do you recognise this?
No,
I think we're all struggling slightly with that figure.
It's in the NAO report, I think.
Operating costs of British Steel.
Yeah.
So I think in FY26, the operating costs for the company were roughly £1.5 billion, when revenue covered roughly 70% of those costs, with HMG funding the gap for the losses.
Sorry, it's 3.18. If spending continues at current rates, could exceed 1.5 billion in 2028, depending on policy changes that might be taken in the future in the NO report.
All right, bear with me.
This is a report.
Oh, I see. Yes, no,
Yeah.
I'm kind of...
So my question is, appreciate you might not have known it was 1.5 billion, but it has gone up by 500 million since last year. So my query is, in 12 months, we've already seen a 33% increase in the operation and in the costs. My question is are we certain about that 1.5 billion, given the independent valuer who will be appointed will also determine compensation? So can we be sure that this isn't going to increase in the next sort of 6 to 12 months, depending on where we are in the process?
It's probably, in terms of the independent valuer will come in and value the business at the point of nationalisation, if it happens, subject to the public interest test. So actually, bizarrely, the higher the cost to the department, if you project forward the losses through to 2028 or beyond, of course, the lower the value of the company. And that's essentially why we have the view that at the moment the company is valueless. It is making significant losses every year. And if you present value those back in order to establish what the equity value is, the present value of the future cash flow to the shareholder is negative. So that's zero. The other way of looking at the valuation of the company is that you would look at the realisation that creditors would get on a winding up, and also again the losses that the company is generating indicate that there would be little or no return for any of the creditors. So that number of the 1.5 actually the worse it is, the more it makes the case that the company is not valuable. And although it's strategically important to us, it's not commercially valuable to us.
So I've now caught up with where you are, with a bit of help from my friends here. You are right that if we, as I said earlier, we had spent 453 million in the last financial year, so 25-26. If you roll that forward and assume we're spending roughly the same amount of money for 3 financial years, that's how you get to the 1.5 billion. Yes. Now, we are assuming that will change over time, and indeed that it will decline over time, but also how that interacts then with any compensation that the independent valuer might find to Jingye is the point that David is making. Yeah. So yes, this all does fit together. Yeah.
Right. So the independent. So
sorry for being slow to catch up.
No, it's okay. So within that 1.5 billion, it includes the. Because as I understand it, the independent valuer has that person been commissioned to determine? So it might be an additional cost to the 1.5 billion.
As it says very clearly in the paragraph you refer to, the 1.5 billion is before potential transformation or compensation to Jingye.
Fine. And your response to me was that the independent valuer might not come back with a significant increase due to the marginality of the.
Personal opinion, I would be surprised if they came back with any number at all. But I think, given we have an important relationship with international investors in this country, it's important to us that we deal with Jingye fairly. It's a matter of public record. We have engaged with them in commercial negotiations around the acquisition by us of the company. It's fair to say we were miles apart, and so actually the idea of getting an independent valuer appointed, who would be appointed after the nationalisation bill has come in, and after, if the public interest test is met, the nationalisation is actually implemented. It's actually quite a good way of amicably sorting out a disagreement between commercial people, I think.
And if I could follow up on that, I completely agree. Litigation risks, geopolitical risks, if you have an independent body. My second question is just around. Obviously, we're assuming nationalisation. There are other options on the table. Conservatorships is one option, and also potentially a private sector interest, but perhaps might take into account the SS UK provider as well, so we can create a broader ecosystem that doesn't just include British Steel. Without getting into without getting into commercial sensitivities here, I'm assuming maybe you can clarify: are we looking at a more expansive offer than just British Steel as part of a private sector provision here, so that we can potentially get an interested party involved?
I think it's fair. I mean, I think it's fair to say that government policy is pursuing the nationalisation bill in relation to British Steel. The prospect of combining British Steel would be a matter for ministers, but the one thing I would note is my view is that at the moment British Steel is not investable. It has an excellent management team, but it has significant management capability gaps. It does not have a view, it does not currently have a prospect of a transformation project to get to the EVE. It hasn't got a transition project in place which would get it to changing from blast furnace to electric arc furnace, so that at the moment I think it would be a surprise to me if a private sector investor were to come in right now. I think there's a huge amount of work, and that's what we're committed to do as quickly as we can, subject to the nationalisation.
Can I just ask David Neil to add on this point about the wider conglomeration that you're talking about?
Yeah, so SSUK and British Steel, and indeed Port Talbot as well, were all part of one company at one time. We obviously look at the synergies between them. I think what I would say is, they all need significant investment to get to the future that we want to see for them, where they are commercially viable. That investment, as we've just talked about, cannot all come from government, right? So that requires a lot of input from the private sector. In fact, the majority of the money is going to have to come from the private sector. My personal view, for what it's worth, if I'm asked to advise ministers, is I think that is easier to do in bite-sized chunks, and that is easier to do in the separate companies than putting them together at the outset. And I do believe the private sector can play a role in SSUK, and I do believe the private sector can play a role in British Steel if they commercially between them can find synergies. And by the way, I believe the private sector will be better at identifying those synergies. Then of course we would encourage that.
Thank you.
You. Sarah.
I was going to turn to the impact of trade measures, if you'd like me to carry on, Chair, which I will. My question was going to be about how you're assessing whether the new tariffs are protecting UK steelmakers without imposing undue costs elsewhere in the supply chain, because I'm sure you will have had feedback that it's caused a great deal of concern.
I can assure you we've had feedback, and indeed we're listening to it. Can I just start with a little bit of myth busting? Because one of the things that I'm quite worried about on the steel trade measures is there has become an assumption for some businesses that these measures are applied to any import of steel. That is not the case. It is only where the steel trade measures are only going in where there is production in the UK. And that is a really important distinction. So it is really important that downstream users are checking whether the specific products that they require are affected by steel trade measures or not. We have definitely had examples of businesses assuming that that was the case, and it is not. So you want to come back to me on that before I carry on, but it's really important that we are clear about it. It does not cover every steel import.
Where would a business find that clarity? So if I give you an example, and I'm happy to take this outside of the committee, but I have a constituency business where they're a manufacturing success story. They employ 150 people. They've had 40 apprenticeships, and they cannot get the steel they need to produce what they produce in the UK. Right now they're worried in the way that you've just described. But where did they get that clarification from?
So the first thing that they can do, we've published on gov.uk the provisional quotas. So they will be able to check whether the type of steel that they are producing is indeed covered by those measures. I do need to give you a slight wrinkle on my statement. It is true that not every steel import is produced is covered by the measures. However, because of the endless complexity of steel, both in terms of the different size and measurements that different steel products come into, there are some circumstances where steel specific products that are made in certain sizes and lengths is made in the UK, but not others, but are covered by the steel measures. And that's because it's the level of specificity of the individual product. The really boring explanation is we can only enforce these measures at an 8-digit standard industry classification point at the point at which things come over the border. So they may be affected even though there isn't production in the UK. The headline is the information, though, at that 8-digit customs code level is available on the gov.uk website with additional guidance that we published subsequently to help people understand some of the transitional arrangements that we have also put in place.
If I may, Chair, I might ask if I can share the specific example.
Write to me afterwards.
Exactly.
That's absolutely fine.
But I'm not sure I've got an answer to my original question.
Sorry, no.
Around how you're responding to the feedback, because so far you've said you'd like to provide clarity.
Yes.
So what else are you doing?
So
will there be exemptions, for example?
So we have been listening. We've held a number of roundtables. Ministers have held a number of roundtables, and teams are doing this as well with downstream users to make sure that we have understood the concerns that they have had about the provisional measures that we have forewarned people of. We are currently going through a quite complex process to try and work through the different feedback that we've had, and I am anticipating that we will make some limited changes to reflect some of the feedback that we've had from downstream users in finalising the quotas that we hope to be able to publish soon. So we've listened, we will be making some changes. Please hear me that I said limited, but we have been, because we're trying to balance domestic production and indeed downstream users, but we've been listening to the feedback. But also we will be reviewing the measures every 12 months to ensure that they're working in the way that we anticipate and we're having they're having the impact that we expect. But also the way that we're doing the quota administration is really important here. So unused quota from one quarter will roll into the next quarter as well. So there's a number of different mechanisms. We will be monitoring carefully. We will be able to use the flexibility of underused quotas from one quarter to a next, but we will be reviewing the measures annually to make sure they're having the impact.
Will that update be shared before the 1st of July? You said you're working through all of that feedback and providing clarity.
We are working very hard to ensure that that is in the public domain before the 1st of July. That's the intention.
And it won't be reviewed for another 12 months after
That's
that?
correct, yeah.
So if they don't hear before the 1st of July that they're not going to be clobbered, they've got to wait another 12 months to see if they will be less clobbered.
By the 1st of July, we will be, hopefully, fingers and toes crossed, because these are complex discussions that are ongoing, be able to provide clarity on the quotas for the year ahead. We will then be monitoring the situation over the next 12 months and reviewing at the 12-month period.
Thank you, Chair.
Pick that up. I think there are a lot of MPs had representations from constituents. Yeah. Minister had a meeting with MPs the other day. A lot of people were there. Detailed examples. You began by indicating that the intention was not to make sure, or to make sure that businesses downstream were not affected by these measures, because you weren't going to be changing quotas or tariffs for particular types of steel which couldn't be produced in the UK.
That's correct. Unless it is at a point at which there is some domestic protection in a category where we cannot enforce the measures if we go to this particular level of granularity that would require us to be able to do that.
Explain that a bit more, because often that sort of granularity affects particularly small companies.
Yeah. So this is down to the example that the team took me through, and indeed the Secretary of State through in great detail, was looking at different types of steel pipes that come in both different diameters and different lengths. Certain diameters and certain lengths do have UK production, certain diameters and certain lengths do not have UK production, but they are all under the, I'm slightly simplifying for effect, the same 8-digit standard industrial classification code, and that is the level at which HMRC are able to enforce the measures. So we can't go to an increasing level of detail to be able to distinguish at that point between UK and not, where there isn't UK production.
A company then that relies on the sorts of pipes that are going to be affected.
In which case, I'm afraid they will need to be using the quota and paying the out of quota tariff.
Might put them out of business.
Well, yes, I'm afraid that may well be the case.
I've got a company called Ansell Tools. I went to see them. Small company, employing a few workers. They've been there for a long time. John Anson now runs the business. What they've said to me is, they can get the steel that gets supplied them currently from the UK, but when they've gone to companies here to produce it, they've been given, you've got to buy for a whole year. They say, first of all, the cost they can't afford up front. They haven't got the storage capacity, and on top of that, they haven't got the storage capacity, and they're going to have to pay a lot more money, either which they can't afford up front, or to go to a stockholder, which they've been told to do, and they're going to put an extra cost on them as well. This is a small company, very small margins. It'll be out of business if you carry on like this.
So I appreciate the challenge that you are posing to us, but we have worked really hard to handle this as best we can, to manage the tension between supporting domestic production in the way that we have spent most of this conversation focused on with downstream users. We cannot find a perfect match for that, and also I can't account for commercial decisions that suppliers might make in the way that you're suggesting, in terms of asking businesses to commit to a year's supply.
Yeah, but that's because they haven't had a UK supplier for that sort of reason. That's why they've gone to companies overseas. It doesn't help to say that you can't help them in that situation, because if you don't help them, they're out of business. Small family firm. Now, is there nothing the department can do in terms of a fallback, where you've got specific examples of companies that will be affected, that can't actually get out of the impacts of the measures you're bringing in?
I can take that away and look at it further, but I recognise that this is an extremely challenging situation where we are dealing with competing arse of both downstream users and our domestic producers.
Yeah, but nevertheless, you could have a look at what you could do. And so far, I don't think there's been a feedback about what you might do in addition to simply trying to alter the codes and the tariffs, etc.
Yeah. I hear you. I'll take it away.
Right, any questions? Right, thank you very much for coming along today and giving evidence to the committee. An uncorrected transcript of this hearing will be published on the committee's website in the coming days. We'll consider the evidence provided. We'll produce a report in due course, and hopefully you'll come back to us in due course with more information as a complex and challenging situation starts to develop in the next few months.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Order, order.